And by the way, I am Annette Smith-Doring. I'm the Workforce Development Manager for Sutter Health in the Sacramento Sierra region, and I'm so excited to have you guys here today. The Nursing Task Force got together and figured out a couple of different things that we could do to address the nursing shortage, one of which was to do an expansion of the American for College program, nursing program, yay, thank you, which was very successful, and we did in fact meet our commitment of 120 additional nurses for the Sacramento community. Another thing that came out of that project, though, get some great minds in the room working together, and it's amazing what you can come up with. So the Regional Nursing Student Orientation was one of those, where we found out that every hospital was doing multiple orientations every year. The core students were maybe having to go through, 4 different hospital orientations during their academic career. So is there a way that we could do it better? So now we do it twice a year for all the incoming first semester nursing students. And they only have to sit with kind of 1.5 times because they're set facility-specific stuff. So the other thing that came out, and this project was a year in the making, and having conversations, and healthcare is moving so fast. It's really hard to keep up. It's hard for the hospitals to keep up. The whole flu thing last year was a great example of where we had 30 days to respond to a CDC requirement that everyone have a flu shot or a declination. And so we had to figure out how to make that work and how to have you guys help us, have the students make that work for them. And so we thought, everything's changing so fast. Is there an opportunity where we can share with the faculty some of the core things that are really important to the hospitals today in the greater Sacramento region, and things that we are held accountable for, and ensure that everyone's getting the information at the same time, because we are now holding your students accountable for understanding what those things are. So out of that came today. There's been a lot of work. Stacy Sanborn from Shriners Hospital has been working with the work to put this together, and she's done a fabulous job. Thank you, Stacy. And you're going to hear from 2 keynote speakers, and then we're going to do a panel. The panel this afternoon is their opportunity to ask questions. If there's anything that's been looming on your mind, you want to know why we do things the way we do in the hospitals, is there a way to do it different? If you guys have ideas about things that we could do differently, that's our dialogue time. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Debbie Ward. Dr. Ward is an associate clinical professor and the founding faculty member of the Betty Irene Moore School of Nursing at the University of California, Davis. Yay! We're so excited to have a school of that caliber added to the wonderful group that we already have here in Sacramento. It's just, now we truly are we're just it. Her bachelor's degree in government is from Oberlin College in Ohio, and her master's degree in nursing is from Yale University in Connecticut. She started her work in nursing as a home health aide. Educated as a family nurse practitioner, she practiced in an inner-city primary care center and a public health geriatric clinic prior to earning her PhD in health policy from Boston University, where she was a Pew Doctoral Fellow. Dr. Ward spent 21 years at the University of Washington School of Nursing in the Department of Psychosocial and Community Health. Her practice and scholarly interests include health policy and politics, and the changing content and structure of health service delivery in the U.S.
Hi, everybody. So I'm really thrilled to be here. You may ask yourself, why would a person on a smooth road to retirement at the University of Washington leave Seattle? As I was just up there last week, so anything you've learned about health policy in the last week, I don't know it. You'll have to tell me. But I was up in Seattle last week, and it's perfectly nice there, but I had to return to the Central Valley, the place of my birth, Bakersfield, California, that other end of the Central Valley. So it was just karma that made it happen that a brand new nursing school got to be started, and a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for a crank who's always said, if I was in charge of nursing education, I would do it this way. And then somebody said to me, well, do you want to be in charge of some nursing education? Oh my God. So there's dreaming and there's happening. But I'm thrilled to be here with you today, basically as the cover act for Jan, who's going to tell you all the things you really need to know about healthcare regulation, while I get to just wax eloquent about making health systems healthy, and have a little time in the next 40 minutes, because I will pay good attention to the break, have some time for discussion. So I spent most of my life as a nurse as a political junkie. It was partly because I was a government major at Oberlin in the 60s. I don't know if any of you are that old, but that meant that in that little corner, little politically active corner of Ohio, I did those things that you had to do in the 1960s. Some of you really don't know what that was, but I'll tell you that it included wearing my hair a certain way. It was kind of a mullet thing, actually. Dressing in a certain way, some of which I've continued to this day. And then when I moved up to the country in the 70s, it was the time when you couldn't have paper towels. You know, you just had to have that horrible pile of rags underneath your sink because it was running the earth to have paper towels. Needless to say, now that I'm old, I do allow myself a paper towel or two. But the 60s is still alive in me, and you will hear some of it today as I talk. And you must take it all with a grain of salt. It's political opinion. That's my business. And whenever that happens, everybody else gets to have opinions too. The only difference is I'm up here with a mic. So when I was in nursing school, I had a lot of political questions. I wondered why medical education was so heavily subsidized by the federal tax dollar, and nursing education was not, and to this day is not. Medical education is subsidized 50 times more at the federal level than nursing education. And when I worked in an inner city primary care center, I wondered why there was not a guaranteed basic level of care for everybody, and why some people came into this clinic desperately poor and were treated in some instances unfairly and in other instances truly unjustly. And then as a teacher, I've wondered why the popular TV shows are ER and Scrubs and not Betsy Smith, Public Health Sanitarium. Because, so I've wondered all my life about the politics and policy of healthcare, and now I get to be in this new nursing school where we have two important foci: healthy people, healthy systems. We're talking about population health, and I'd be glad to tell people more about that later. But we're talking particularly also about healthy systems, and that's what I get to talk with you today. I get to spend a little time with you to connect faculty to policy and my own particular love, politics, and to think with you about how students can be connected as well. So here's an important question. What does make health? It's a 15-second rule. All of you are teachers, you know it. Just pause, sweat runs down your flanks a little bit, but you wait and you think that some person whose eyes you catch, like you. So what makes for health?
Well, it's how you define health. I mean, you have
Okay, good
physical
and start. Yeah,
physical
okay.
and mental, and
Okay, let's say complete holistic well-being.
all
You don't
body
have to- there's not-
systems in synergy. How about that?
Oh, that's great. That's great. I think that's a little bit of a definition, but that's great. All body systems in synergy. That's really a wonderful definition. I'm going to give you a hint here.
Okay, good.
Ooh, but I keep going backwards. That looks bad, doesn't it? What do you think individual healthcare services contribute to health? A lot? A little? More than half? You're shaking your head in just the right way. What do you think,
Well,
Arlene?
I think they contribute a lot, but only if there's access.
Okay, good start. That's right. If you can't get to them, what could they contribute? Absolutely, and that's a great, huge piece of the political arguments that are going on today. But just think about, you know, individual healthcare services, getting to see your nurse, getting to see. You were shaking your head in that way. Tell me what you were thinking.
I'm always concerned about the motivation behind the services, as far as if you know, for profit and the greater well-being.
Good question. So you question the motives of the services that are being delivered. Where's a good public health nurse in this room? Yay. Okay. So what about
socioeconomic policies?
Genetics.
You remember?
What do you think, Kathleen? Genetics contribute a lot to health?
A piece of it, yes.
A pretty substantive piece, actually. Some people say individual health services, maybe 10%, genetics, maybe 30%. Of course, there are huge arguments about this, right? We could argue all day. Let's go to one. So here's our public health nurse. Environments, the air we breathe, the traffic we live in, the safety of our neighborhoods, right? What other, can you think of other environmental things?
Socio and economic policies like social determinants.
Great. Can you tell everybody what the social determinants of health are?
Where you live, your race, your culture, your gender, your ability to have access or lack of access.
Right. Your networks, your friends, your jobs, all of those things around you. And these are, of course, the things. So they take away my public health nursing card if I don't start every talk reminding us all that these contribute a little. These are fixed, although they may not be fixed for much longer, right? So that's going to be interesting. These contribute a lot, but really big time are the social determinants of health. Your income, your gender, your background, your neighborhood. So those are the things that really make a huge difference. And it's a really interesting question right now in the midst of this fierce political debate about health reform, that all the talk, well, the drug companies erase what I just said. The pharmaceutical industry and many of us would be very interested in this. But the talk is all about individual health services, which in fact contribute a modest amount to health, but which are income drivers and support us all. But nonetheless, health delivery systems are really important. As much as I'd like us to spend a massive amount of the national intellect and treasure on the things that build up the social determinants of health, for instance, parks. Where's the park nurse, right? The recreation department nurse. We will have that person, I think, before too long when the economy turns around. Because think about building your park systems to be allied with your health delivery systems. Reimbursement, let's put that question aside for a minute, but just let's think about parks and transportation and all of the things that we could spend tons of our treasure on. But I'm not an idiot. It's the systems that deliver services, and they're really important economically. So health systems are an enormous driver of our economy. How much of the gross domestic product do Americans spend on health? Most of it. More than any other country in the world. More than any other country in the world. Right now it's about 17% of the gross domestic product we spend on health care. The next cheapest one is Switzerland at about 12%. As chance would happen, I've spent a lot of time in Switzerland, so I'm sort of the sole health policy expert in the world who spent the most time in the two most expensive healthcare systems in the world. And Switzerland wastes an incredible amount of money. Each little canton in Switzerland, each little state feels that it needs to be its own little medical mecca. So every single one of them has to have its own Sitzigamishi machine and its own MRIs and its own whatever. You get a headache in Switzerland, you will go to MRI faster than any person you have ever seen because they have all these machines lying around within 20 miles of each other that must absolutely get used. Nonetheless, even with all this waste, they still manage to spend 5 or 6% less of their GDP on healthcare than we do. And interestingly enough, their outcomes are better. But economically, so we spend an enormous amount, and as somebody said, the most expensive healthcare system in the world. And this is all about illness care services, right? Very little on prevention. our public health nurse friend in the back could say maybe none at all on social determinants, maybe some, but not a whole lot. And but let's also remember in this economic thing, lest I get all high and mighty about this, one person's expense is my paycheck and your paycheck, Vicki, isn't it the truth? So we have to kind of say, here we are in the belly of the beast of benefiting from a system that spends an enormous amount of our national resource on individual healthcare services. So they're really important economically. Why do you think they're important politically?
It's political systems that drive the choice of where how we spend our economic resources. And it's political systems that create policies that are going to determine how we set up our delivery systems.
Did everybody hear that? Political systems are going to set up the policies that show how we spend our money. And there's some very interesting national characteristics, not because we're bad people, not even because we're necessarily greedy people, but because we are who we are with a political culture that we grew up with and has been passed down to us. And so there's a great deal of interest in delivering politically valuable services. So let me describe two types of service for you. I don't want to make this coarse or too obvious, but I guess I can't help it. So let's look on the one hand, a preemie born to a movie star couple who gets 6 months in the ICU. And there's an article in People magazine about the brave physicians and maybe with any luck the brave nurses who take care of this baby in the ICU. There's a great deal of political capital in that story, isn't there? So a smart local politician, seeing that the University of California at Davis, just to pick a hospital out of the blue, that the University of California at Davis was getting good press about a famous baby who was being saved, and do not go away from this saying, you know, that Debbie Ward thinks that the babies of famous people should be left to die on the street. I do not believe that at all. I'm contrasting the political capital that goes along with one story and goes along with another story. So let's pick an unpopular story on this side, but a good health story that wouldn't get good press.
A CHF patient that didn't get readmitted for a whole year because of the work of the CHF clinic.
Did everybody hear that? A CHF patient who didn't get admitted for a whole year because there was great monitoring by some nurses possibly being carried on, even maybe with high-tech machinery and your weight, sent in on a telephone to somebody. That could be fantastic too. Or back to Betsy Smith Public Health Sanitarium, right? A water supply that stayed clean. I defy us to construct the headline in the Sacramento Bee, water systems clean again.
Still good.
Still clean. Still drinking clean water. Exactly. So politically, our health delivery systems do get built around things that have high political capital. And so clean water, not so much. Maybe older person congestive failure, not so much. Premature baby, particularly premature baby of famous people, quite a lot. This is not to say that we are evil or wrong for having these attractions to these different stories. It probably makes deep evolutionary sense that we're more attracted to sick babies than to sick older people. But politically, it ends up meaning that we spend money in very special ways in this country. And then, of course, also, we have these health delivery systems because we have to serve the public interest. I wanted to mention one other story about politically. Did anybody follow what happened when Ted Kennedy first was diagnosed with a brain tumor and where he went for care? Do you remember that?
I don't remember where he went for care, but I was impressed that he was in surgery within like 2 days.
He was in surgery fast, wasn't
Because he
he?
had pneumonia.
Yes, that's very interesting. He had good access. They have a very, very good health plan. But does anybody know, did Ted Kennedy stay in Massachusetts? The state in the nation with the most medical schools per capita per square inch of any state in the country? No, he went to North Carolina. He went to Duke in North Carolina. And it created a very fascinating political firestorm on the blogosphere about what was wrong and right about the senator from Massachusetts leaving Massachusetts to go to Duke to get his brain operated.
Could have been worse, he could have gone to Ecuador.
Well, you know, worse, better, worse, could have promoted the Ecuadorian health industry, which needs a kick in the pants, right? Who are we to say, right? So, they're important, these health systems. And what are they? They are the systems that deliver healthcare services. They are public health systems, like our friend in the back. And then there are other public and private systems that might support health. And so we were talking earlier about the water system, the school system, the park system, the transportation. Actually, all of these are health systems. And there's a very interesting group from UCLA that's saying that we should blow up the whole way we think about health systems and make sure that it's not just hospitals who come to the table, but the water board, the school board, the parks board, and the transportation board. But then those of you who are trying to put students into clinical sites would say, oh, for God's sake, don't let the water board join this group of hospitals that are all already
Clinical at the water treatment facility.
So they're all, of course, connected to the politics and policy of health.
Right next door.
And then this question comes up. Are politics and policy the same thing?
No.
I gave the answer too quick. No, all policy is political, but not all politics are policy. Does anybody know the difference between the two? Which is which? What's what? Politics. Well, I guess we should say, raise your hand if you have a positive view of the word politics. Oh my gosh, where am I going to find my friends? I'm the only one that's going like this. Fantastic game. So interesting. Oh, I'm making your life really difficult, aren't I?
That's okay.
Is it okay?
You're keeping me awake.
Okay. Politics is the can. What can we do? So, of course, it involves compromise. And when we have another chance to go off and spend an hour together, let's talk about what's happened with the extremism of American politics that makes compromise a dirty word. Compromise is politics are all about compromise. So it's the can. And then policy is the should. We should do it this way. These are the rules. This is how we should carry it out. But when I say all policy is political, those of you who think policy is neutral, is politically neutral, I want you to change your mind about that. Because policy always springs from some political aim. If we decide there should be a policy about something, we've already made a political decision. And we say we're going to pay attention, for instance, to AIDS in the workplace. If we're going to make a policy about AIDS in the workplace, then we're acknowledging that patients, students, professionals in the workplace will be HIV positive, and we will make policy about that in order that everybody gets treated fairly. But you could choose to deny that that's a fact, right? And that would be a political decision to say, oh, there's no problem with HIV in the workplace. Policy is the should, and politics is the can. And then there are nurses. The first 10 years of my life as a political nurse, I went around saying to crowds of nurses, well, I don't think I was quite this stupid, but I sort of said, nurses are not very political. But then I thought to myself, what are you thinking about? Because they've all worked in hospitals. Many of them have worked in hospitals. And is there a more political animal than a hospital full of cans and need for compromise and and warring states over scarce resources, right? Fighting for scarce resources, figuring out how to solve problems. So nurses have always been political. They may not have always been political in the most forthright way. They may not have always been political in the strongest way, but they've always had great political sense because they have always worked in healthcare systems, and they know about women, because many of them are. They know about power, because sometimes they don't have so much, and they know about money, because they used to not have any at all. Now they have some, and they work in systems that are filled to the brim with money. And then I always need to say a little something about Florence, our foremother. How many of you had to take a course in nursing school about Florence Nightingale? And did you just go, oh, Florence? Are your eyes telling me, oh, Florence? Oh, what was the book? I did too. Do you remember the book? What was the book? Oh, Notes on Nursing. Well, now I'm going to tell you, no, it is. Notes on Nursing actually is Virginia Henderson. Florence Nightingale was, what's that other book? Anyway, I'm going to tell you about the one you should have read. She wrote a book called Cassandra, and she wrote it before her parents, and the woman was in her 30s, and remember when these times were, her parents would not allow her to go to nursing school. Do you remember why?
She was supposed to get married.
She was supposed to get married and she turned him down. But why didn't a well-bred woman go to nursing school? No.
They were prostitutes.
Well, we'll talk about the prostitute thing too. I mean, that's very, very interesting. And that, well, let me just lay that myth bare too, because that's very important. I know we've always been told our foremothers were prostitutes. And, well, no. Our professional foremothers were prostitutes. Yeah, woe betide me if I discourage your family. No, our professional foremothers were prostitutes. Well, in fact, if you looked at the capacity of women at the beginning of the hospital era in America to make money, it was extremely limited. And so trading one's sexual favors for whatever was very common practice. It happens now all the time with different sorts of regulations and channels. But back in the day, so this is, pre-Civil War, the idea of a low-income woman, especially a woman by herself, trading her sexual favors for goods and services made perfect sense. So it wasn't just those women who were in the hospitals, it's the poor women who were working in the sweatshops and in the, everybody was doing it, sort of the general consensus at the time. My former hometown, Seattle, as it turns out, they looked back at the census and they could determine that at one time during the gold rush, approximately 70% of the tax basis in Seattle came from prostitution. So that was an interesting study to do, and it tells us something about our foremothers. But going back to Florence, who was not, you're right, exactly what her parents were terrified of. And why was that? What was the thing? I mean, well, I'll just go ahead, because I want you to love this phrase as much as I do. The naked bodies of strangers. You should not, a lady did not come in contact with the naked bodies of strangers, especially the male naked bodies of strangers, but the naked body of any stranger. So think about the cuffs, the hat, the collar, all of that to put that line between us and the naked bodies of strangers, which were, in fact, our work. Florence was so interesting about this. She actually didn't care too much about the naked bodies of strangers, although she was very interested in raising a generation of nurses, but she wanted them to be homely, and they could not be married. Isn't that interesting? They could be widowed, but they could not have an active partner life, an actively partnered life. Isn't that interesting? So that was sort of the rules about drawing that line between the woman and the naked bodies of strangers. But was this woman political? She was a political dynamo, including the fabulous story of her going to teach in the Crimea, right? Or to you know, change the lives of soldiers in the Crimea, right? With her own fortune, her own considerable fortune, she arrived in the Crimea where the death rate was something like 50%. She arrived with a battalion of nurses and trunks of goods, clean blankets, cream, fortified wine, all kinds of things to clean up with, foods and whatnot. She came, she was not welcomed by the military. The military did not want Florence to have even shown up in the Crimea, and the military director of that hospital said he would not greet her. So they arrived. Have any of you seen the pictures of what that wreck looked like? Right, it was a ruin they were trying to make a hospital of. The rooms are filled. The men are in filthy blankets. They are crying in pain. The pestilence, the death rate, just a horror show. Florence arrives with her clean nurses and her big cases of stuff, and the guy won't come out and greet her, so they sit down on their trunks and they wait. This is a political genius. She didn't create a storm. She didn't attempt to get, to overstep her bounds by going to him. She just sat and waited. And finally, after a couple of hours, as people learned what was in the trunks, saw the nurses, saw them with all their money ready to help, the idiot medical director guy was forced to come out and greet her and let her begin her work, and so within a year she reduced the death rate to something like 2% with her fabulous work. She's a wonderful politician. I don't know if any of you know about Mary Breckinridge in the Frontier Nursing Service. She was the daughter of the Russian ambassador under Coolidge's administration, raised in Paris, raised in Moscow and then Paris. She came back to the family, the ancient family home in Kentucky, and started the Frontier Nursing Service. And her wonderful biography called Wide Neighborhoods tells you all about all of the political stuff she did to win over the backcountry people as well as the politicians of Kentucky. And then some of you, of course, may know about the Henry Street settlement where Florence Wold went in and worked as a neighbor, a compassionate neighbor with the people in this poor neighborhood. So nurses have always been political and able to put their politics right up front. So then here's us. How do we bring our students into this world of healthcare delivery? And they have lots of opportunities to engage in health politics and policy. So we do coursework, which I'm sure you do just like I do, where people talk about political and ethical quandaries, the right to die, the money spent on that premature baby I talked about. They do community work, where they come into communities and see politics at work. And because we are so lucky that we get to call this a piece of our work, we engage in advocacy for our patients that can put us all over the political map, many different sides of it. So some of you, especially on those days when 30 different people are telling you why to do something, you say, why do we have to have these policies? Well, of course you know that. Because we were historically wedded to certain rules, but over time we also figured out that our organizations needed codes and that the public trust requires some standardization. And the school's role, I hear tell, I haven't had to experience it yet, but I hear tell that there's sometimes some tension between the schools and the agencies. Am I wrong about this? There's sometimes a little tension between the schools and the agencies, between the schools and the hospitals? Well, that's probably as it should be, because one side is business and the other side is academia. Of course, academia is business too, but we just like to pretend it is. And it's a different kind of business. But the rates of change in those two places and the rates of decision-making are extremely different. Now, I landed from the University of Washington into the University of California. So I came from a state and I said, I know about bureaucracy, I know. when I landed at the University of California, I was a piker as far as bureaucracy was concerned. I have never in my life, and this is my native state, seen as convoluted a bureaucracy as the University of California is able to exact over us. Nonetheless, they say, jump, and I say how high, but I see the difference between the decision-making process even on the two sides of the campus. So the decision-making process on the Davis side of the campus is kind of different from the decision-making process on the health system side. Very interesting, these big changes. And these two sides, I'll use my own as an example, the two sides get quite irritated with each other, the Davis side and the health system side. I'm not telling tales out of school, you know that would be true, just as you may get irritated with your school system and your agency system. But remember, think back to Florence in those early times, remember that the delivery system used to be the nursing school, right? How many of you, oh, don't tell me. I'll use my own sainted mother. My own sainted mother, who graduated from the Yale School of Nursing about 50 years before I did, not that many years, 40 years before I did, her classroom was the hospital. And before she was dry behind the ears, she was the night nurse in the newborn nursery. You know, those were the days. Maybe they're still the days. But that division, the division between the school and the agency was loose. And some would even say unfair and exploitive. My own sainted mother, when I set off for nursing school, said to me, "You know, they're going to ask you to obey." She did not feel I had a great future in nursing. It was lucky that that turned out to be wrong, and some of that may have happened with the split between the school with certain morals about, or certain guidelines about academic freedom, and the hospital, which in the day was a very rule and obedience-based organization. But when nursing schools were a part of the delivery system, that was probably a bad idea, although Ann and I just had a little conversation, and she is daydreaming about maybe there'll be some great big circling around again in the hospitals and that health agency in the sky will take on all the clinical training of students, but we'll be dead before. There are different goals, and their timing is different. We're lucky that we no longer have nursing schools in hospitals. And finally, let me finish up with a little bit of thought about patient safety, nursing students, and the public trust. Now, the student gets to come in as a learner, and that's one good reason why it's good that we no longer have the nursing school as part of the hospital, because they were very quick to want to identify the student not as a learner, but as a sort of worker, right? A ready worker. And that was fallacious and dangerous. The student comes in as a critical thinker. So the student comes into the hospital system, and like somebody said it right away, the question about where does the money go? Who is making money out of this? Why? If the literature says that there's way too much back surgery, why are we opening a spine center? Right? Those are very interesting questions, and students need to be able to ask those questions as critical thinkers apart from the industry of producing healthcare services. And then the student is the whistleblower and guardian, and I'll tell you this one great story. Did any of you read a book called Blind Eye? 1999, the author's name is Stewart. It was about a physician who was killing patients. And the only person to find him out was the nursing student. The nursing student discovered him mucking about with an IV. And she reported him, as she properly should have done. Lamentably, it didn't go any further than that, because it was a system that didn't allow for that kind of calling out of those mistakes. And that student carried with her the rest of her life the notion that she could have, if she had risked probably getting thrown out of school. She could have gone further and blown the whistle on this guy. So but our students are potential whistleblowers and guardians, and it's part of our job, pushing them into their job as part of the public trust, to make sure that as they are in our institutions, they do carry out the public trust. That's part of their job. And it's part of my job now to stop and let there be a couple of questions or comments in the last few minutes I have with you. Thank you so much for letting me yak at you today. Here's the 15 seconds. Anybody want to ask any questions about health reform? Where's it going? Where's it going? There's no debate. You know, your guess is totally as good as mine on this one. You know, we live in an interesting country. And the only developed country in the world that hasn't said everybody should get some kind of basic access to these services, all for all kinds of very interesting reasons. And then we come into this debate now again. How many of you lived through, we've lived through multiple revolutions of this, haven't we? So most of you were alive when the Clinton plan crashed and burned, and then before that, does anybody remember that Nixon wanted to make HMOs sort of the law of the land? Has anybody lived that long? And then we can go back even further. I fortunately wasn't alive then. Franklin Roosevelt, so revolution after revolution. And you can see the little bitty changes. We do in fact have Medicare. And the American Medical Association at the time said they would die on their sword before such a plan was, such a travesty was perpetrated on the American public. So, we'll see. There's I think some set of changes are going to come about, and if they don't come out at the federal level, they're going to come state by state. Massachusetts is now the latest state to try to make universal access, and here, attend to this, nurses. They didn't plan ahead carefully enough about who could provide primary care, and the nurses were not raising their hand high enough in Massachusetts saying, the nurses are prepared to do the chronic illness management, the family planning, the counseling, the whatever, so that they could make all of their primary care services met. So when California circles around again and says, okay, maybe we'll try it again in California, let's be sure that we be raising our hands in California to say the nurses are ready to do plenty of the primary care that will be needed, so we don't end up with the shortages that were the case in Massachusetts. Yes.
This afternoon, we're going to look at regulations that are kind of are mandated now for hospitals to implement. And I would be curious about your reflections on whether the impetus for those regulations are about the money that they're saving in our systems, or whether they are focused more altruistically on issues of patient safety, and how those two play back and forth in the creation of these policies.
Did people hear that question? The question is, what's the motivation for the expansion in hospital and agency policies? We'd need to take a course together. You and I could sit down and we could design a course about that. Let me just throw in one piece of what's happening. A very interesting thing has happened in the United States, and we are the leader in the world about this, which is quality of care. It's slowly beginning to dawn on health professionals at all levels that many of the things that we do have no scientific base, right? And that we will, the payers now, and so CMS would be the big one of this, right, for Medicare and Medicaid services, the feds are actually probably leading the way in saying, let's stop paying for things that are stupid. So for example, crazy, what a crazy idea. So for example, bed sores, right, pressure ulcers, or never events that will not be reimbursed again. So at the same time that the push to continue to make money, because there is really a push to make money, there's a lot of money to be made in the healthcare business. The push to make money is happening at the same time as a new level of public and payer scrutiny on what works and what doesn't. And I think part of what's happening now is sort of like the merger business that happened about 10 years ago in the healthcare business, where everybody got kind of afraid about what was going to happen next. Profits started to go down and everybody merged. They held hands with other agencies just as stupid as themselves because they felt afraid. I think some of the proliferation of regulation now is some of that same anxiety to let's try to tighten the ship before we know, so that we can get ready for what the kinds of things that are going to happen next as far as this regulation of quality. You know now that we know that certain parts of the country are very expensive and inefficient. Let's pick one. Florida. Isn't that interesting? What's the age of the population of Florida? And other areas that are extremely efficient. And Sacramento, the Sacramento region, turns out to be one of them. This is an extremely efficient, low-cost, relatively low-cost area compared to, for instance, Orange County. Call me crazy, don't know why there would be those, oh, I do know, and you know too, why there would be those differences. So that's only a partial answer to your question. It's really a good one and bigger than I can fill up. All right, everybody, it's break time. Thank you very much.
As we jump into the alphabet soup of the regulatory environment, Jan Frame is the Director of Integrated Quality Services at Sutter Medical Center in Sacramento. She's had a long career with Sutter in lots of different positions, and we've been called different things during that time. I won't go through all of it. I certainly have. Well, you have your quality, so, you know. Jan is a registered nurse by training, of course. She's also certified in infection control and a certified professional in healthcare quality. She is our go-to expert on all things regulatory. And quite honestly, you're too nice to be a regulatory person. So here's Jan Frame.
Thank you. And just to show you how pathetic my life is right now, I'm in charge of H1N1 for my hospital and the region, and I jumped at a chance to talk about regulatory. So it just to kind of give you the flavor of my life right now. Here's what I want to do today. I had done a brief presentation to another group of, some of you I think were in that group, to kind of talk about the new Joint Commission standards and so forth. And so I was asked to come back and do a broader review on regulatory and accrediting agencies. So that's what I plan to do for the day. And it's not riveting information, but my intention is to get you acquainted with what we're facing in the hospital, the push that we have from external agencies, what the requirements are to meet those external agencies, so forth. I'm not going to, just in case you count, there's 66 PowerPoints. I promise we're not going to get through all those. And I know that's a huge disappointment to most of you. But I believe the ones that I put at the end are fairly self-explanatory, and I really want to spend more time on the front end of the discussion. So I'm going to make you familiar with who the players are that we have to deal with. And I'm only doing the tip of the iceberg because there are, as you know, hundreds of regulatory agencies linked to healthcare and hospital performance. I'm going to discuss the new regs and standards. I'm going to spend a little time on survey processes depending on who the agency is. And at any given time, you may have students in the hospital when we're doing a survey. If they were like me, they ran into a room as soon as they could and started washing their hands, because that's what everybody washes. And then we'll spend a little bit of time on the National Patient Safety Goals from the Joint Commission. So just so you know, as Debbie alluded to earlier, the primary player that we work with out of the federal component is the Centers for Medicare and Medicare Services. They're in Washington, and what they promote and what they enforce are federal regulations. So that's the federal group. They they regulate hospitals. They allow you to get Medicare reimbursement based on what they call conditions of participation. So in order to get Medicare reimbursement, you have to comply with conditions of participation. That is their standards for healthcare performance on the hospital side. From the state of California, we have the California Department of Public Health. They are responsible for licensing the organization and enforcing state laws, as well as Title 22, I'm sure you've heard of Title 22, Title 17. Those are regulations built into the Health and Safety Code in California under which hospitals are required to participate. So they're in charge of licensing. So if you're on the bad side of the CDPH, you can lose your license, which typically is a bad, not the outcome that you're looking for. Then finally, an accrediting organization is the Joint Commission, and that is one of 3 accrediting agencies, by the way. There is a move across the United States now to not always have to go with Joint Commission accreditation, so a few entrepreneurs are springing up with alternate accreditation. The unfortunate part, and the reason why most hospitals go with the Joint Commission, is it is embedded in almost every third-party contract that we have. When your physicians are applying at your facilities, we want them to have practice in a Joint Commission accredited hospital. You cannot have a residency program in your facility without being Joint Commission accredited. So there's a lot of links to Joint Commission, unfortunately. However, it is voluntary, and I use that term loosely, but it is voluntary. They accredit us under, let me start at the beginning. California Department of Public Health, as I said, licenses us. They allow us to practice in the state of California. The Joint Commission, when they come out to survey our hospital during their triennial survey process, if you, quote, pass Joint Commission, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services look at Joint Commission and say, thank you, we know you surveyed to our standards as well. We're going to allow that hospital to continue to receive reimbursement from Medicare and Medicaid services. And I will tell you, I don't think there's a hospital in the United States that can survive without Medicare and Medicaid services, even though it's, maybe the maternity hospital down in Santa Cruz could make it without Medicare and Medicaid. But I think you have followed politically between the Joint Commission and CMS. So CMS is saying, Joint Commission, you're not being tough enough. We go in after you're done and we find all the stuff that you didn't find while we were in there. So the Joint Commission and CMS are fighting in the sandbox. And now CMS will come out and right when you're finished with your Joint Commission survey and you started your vacation, now that CMS shows up and about 5% of the hospitals, 5 to 10% of the hospitals to, quote, validate the Joint Commission survey. So just when you think you're finished with one, another survey team will show up. And they take up residents. I mean, they don't leave. The Joint Commission, is there for your 3 or 5 day survey and then they're gone. You can have, one of our affiliates in the Bay Area 3 years ago, the CMS surveyors were there for a full year after their Joint Commission survey. It was one thing after another. They just kept finding stuff and finding stuff. That poor hospital was under a microscope for a full year. And then they come back to make sure that everything they found while they were there gets corrected over time. So it's just a nightmare to have CMS surveyors in your facility. So there may be some changes in 2010 because the CMS has put out an RFP for organizations that want to provide accreditation to hospitals. So Joint Commission's kind of fighting for its life right now. And so the bad news for us, the Sutters will be surveyed. I think UC's too next year, don't you guys? I think UC Davis is next year. And we're going to have the harder, excuse my language, pissier Joint Commission surveyors who are going to be, trying to make a point with CMS that they can do a good job. By the way, if you have any questions as I go along, just go ahead and ask me. So I want to build a little bit about what Debbie was talking about on this whole notion of CMS pay for performance. How many of you have heard of pay for performance? It's giving on one side and taking away on the other side. What the CMS has asked hospitals to do is participate in analyzing your practice as it relates to several different clinical conditions. And I'm going to go through them. And the reason I'm going to go through them is so when you have students that are out taking care of these patients, we make sure that all the indicators get met because it's important. So CMS invited everybody to participate. Now, if you didn't if you chose not to accept that invitation, you were penalized 2% of your Medicare, Medicaid reimbursement, which for hospitals, like my facility, is millions of dollars. So the notion that you didn't accept the invitation was pretty remote. You decided that would be a career limiting move to not accept that. What they are grading us now. First it was accept the invitation. The second part now is grading your performance on what they're calling core measures. Everybody know core measures? I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about core measures because that's what we get graded on now. They are heart failure, pneumonia, acute MI, and the surgical care improvement project. And I will go over them each one in a little more detail. And hospital outpatient measures have also been added. So they're looking at physician practice in their offices. They're looking at our outpatients that come into our hospital, the patient that comes to the emergency room with chest pain, how quickly we can get an EKG done, how quickly we can give that patient aspirin. And then there's outpatient surgical procedures that they're looking at as well. But they're also looking at the physician practice in their office. So the notion that the physicians aren't a part of the hospital when it comes to the CMS performance is actually very remote. When I say that 2% market reimbursement, what I want to speak to there is if we do well on our core measure performance. In other words, if we are the top 10% of the hospitals, I'll go into this in a little more detail in a minute, you actually get a 2%, you can qualify for a 2% bonus, which again, for our facility is millions and millions of dollars. So you can see that all of a sudden, the administrative suite is very interested now in what's happening clinically with the core measure patients in your facilities. It's really brought out their attention. So what's a core measure? It's elements of a specific diagnostic group that have been considered core to that diagnosis. For example, the hard part is it's primarily based on evidence. However, there is some consensus elements to it as well, and that makes it very difficult in some cases to try to engage your physicians in something that's not 100% evidence-based, and for good reason in my opinion. But here's an example, acute MI. What we are measuring is aspirin within 24 hours of arrival. That can be given in the ambulance on the way in. It can be given when they walk in the door into the ER. A lytic within 30 minutes. What do we know about myocardium, right? The faster you get it perfused, minutes, what do they call it? Minutes of muscle with cardiac. And then the door to reperfusion via heart cath within 90 minutes. So if you have students working in the cath lab, working in the emergency department, at our hospital, we actually page a code STEMI response, ST elevation MI response, and the hospital makes a concerted effort to get that patient over to the cath lab and get the perfusion done within 90 minutes. So it's not just arrival at the cath lab, it's getting perfusion done. So that's the important concepts that they have linked to acute MI. What about pneumonia? During antibiotic in 6 hours. How many of you have been to an emergency room lately? and with H1 and the seasonal influenza coming in H1N1, they count from triage time to when the antibiotic is given. And I will tell you that half the time our patients are still waiting in the waiting room in that 0 to 6 hour window. So this is a particularly challenging standard for the emergency department. But what's important, again, if you have students working in the emergency department, that they recognize a pneumonia patient is a core measure patient and get the skids greased and get things going, get the antibiotic out of the PICSA system and get it going. We're asking about if the patient's going to have blood cultures drawn and go to ICU, that they get drawn before the antibiotic. Is this rocket science to anybody? Hopefully. But the problem is what we have found is the nurse's ability to recall when he or she drew the blood culture and what actually gets recorded on the things sometimes are totally different. So it's prescriptive. They want specific antibiotics based on the type of pneumonia it is and where the patient's ending up. If it's an ICU patient, it's one group of antibiotics. If the patient's going to a med-surg floor, it's another group of antibiotics. They are prescriptive. You can add any more antibiotics that you want, and turn the patient into a fungus ball as long as you meet the requirements for the pneumonia. This is a difficult one because it is not particularly evidence-based. It's a consensus document, so this one is difficult to try to tell our physicians You have to use this group. You can use whatever else you want. Pneumococcal vaccine, if eligible, so that is a year-round process, so no matter what time the patient's in the facility, if they are eligible for pneumococcal vaccine, you have to make sure you give it. Every hospital has some process to allow the registered nurse to do an assessment and give the vaccine if indicated. Seasonal flu, they measure October through March, so anybody eligible for seasonal influenza vaccine, if they haven't received it already, you have to give it while the patient's in the hospital. Just so you know, CMS is black and white with these. When they pick 5 charts every quarter to audit our auditing, and they will find things like, you said the patient came in the ER at 12:01, and we found this other one that said they were there at 11:59. And we get dinged for that. We get points taken away. And if you get below 80% on your audits, your reimbursement at the end of the year can be affected. So they are anal, absolutely anal about how they do that. What about heart failure? It's good I put those things right in the middle of my words. But heart failure, many of these are physician-driven. Assess the ejection fraction. If it's less than 40%, treat it. Very simple, but pretty straightforward. However, where we fall down most time is our discharge teaching, and this is where your students can be particularly helpful in ensuring the patient gets the information they need to know when they're going home about weighing themselves daily, what their activity level is, what their diet is supposed to be. All of those elements have to be recorded in the patient's chart in order for us to get credit for that. If the patient smokes, that you gave smoking cessation information. So all of that information has to be in the record. And if they have a follow-up appointment. Surgical care improvement project, this is the one that almost every hospital is really having a struggle with. What the consent, and again, this is consensus document, says is that there are specific antibiotics that they feel are better for surgical prophylaxis than others. Getting surgeons to change the antibiotic that they've used for the past 25 years, and they don't have any infection problem, so why should they change, is a huge challenge in the organization when everything's been perfect. And if I get one infection, and then you're going to come and take care of my patient. All right, I will. Give me a break. The other part of that is not only the correct antibiotic choice, but the ability to start that antibiotic and have it in the tissues at that incision time, so that you can't give it longer than 1 hour before. So when your students are doing their surgical rotation, if the patient has an antibiotic to be infused, we want to make sure it's not in the waiting room or not in the in the pre-op holding area. We actually want to give it in the surgical suite, and the reason for that is what happens when they're in pre-op holding. There's this one, so-and-so has to take a break, so we got to clean the rooms a little bit, or the room cleaning takes a little bit longer. Pretty soon the clock's ticking, the hour's gone. And this one is evidence-based. There is evidence to support that if you can get that antibiotic within the hour and have good tissue perfusion within the hour, it actually does improve, reduce the risk of post-operative infection. Discontinued within 24 hours of surgery. This even, you know how sometimes we're a little late getting the antibiotic, and then to time it so the next antibiotic gets later, and now pretty soon we're at 24.3 hours after. We actually tell our nurses, don't give that last dose. I mean, that's how tight we have to be. It's an automatic 24-hour stop. We don't really care what the physician writes. They can write for antibiotics for 3 months. We're stopping it at 24 hours after surgery. That is another actually very good evidence-based practice that we put into place. Our surgeons aren't thrilled with it, but who cares about them? No shaving. Everybody knows the no shaving rule. Normothermia during colon surgery. They're expanding this next year for all surgical procedures, that we monitor the patient's temperature during the surgical procedure, and when they get to the recovery room, their temperature should be normal. So that's one of the pushes for all surgeries. In the next, CMS goes from their year starts October to September. So in October, we'll be starting to measure normothermia for all our patients.
Even with cardiac bypass?
Your question is even with cardiac bypass, yes. Won't that be fun?
Glad I'm not on that committee.
And then DVT prophylaxis, if it's appropriate for the patients, that they get acceptable DVT prophylaxis. If they have a contraindication, the surgeon just has to write that in their record. But it has to start within 24 hours of surgery. And one of the challenges we've hit is the pharmacy times it to be given at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and the patient surgery actually ended at 9 o'clock the day before, so we're missing that window. So we're asking nurses to look at that and see when did surgery end, if the Coumadin or whatever's ordered the next day before the 24-hour clock hits. Those are the core measures. And now I want us to talk again briefly about what Debbie alluded to earlier. On one hand, CMS is telling us to perform well and do well with your core measures. You will be, you'll have some financial reimbursement attached to your core measures. Well, here's where they take it away. And these are what you can call them never events, or however you want to call them. We call them HACs, healthcare acquired conditions. And these are patient adverse events that CMS has said they are no longer going to reimburse us for. And you can see up there, I didn't even write all of them up there, but I put quite a few. Many of these are conditions that are extremely costly and labor intensive for the hospital to manage. If a patient comes to you with a pressure ulcer, but then it develops into a 3 or 4 while they're under your care, then we will no longer be reimbursed for that care. For catheter-associated urinary tract infections, if the patient gets coded with a catheter-associated UTI, we will not be reimbursed for that care. Interestingly enough, it's kind of a miracle in our hospital. We don't have any of these, and you know where the coders have to get this information? The physician has to write it. How many physicians have you ever seen write a catheter-associated urinary tract infection? I've never seen it. So it's a miracle. We don't have any of these. And central line infections, unfortunately, I think while many of the ICUs have gotten to 0, hair out on the floor is not quite as good. There's no reimbursement. The way it works at most hospitals is the coders find it, they notify somebody to take a look at it to see if we can talk somebody out of it, and if we can't. And what I mean by that is, say the physician writes catheter-associated urinary tract infection, which they never do, but say they did, and we look at the record and go, you know, this patient came in on Saturday and had this urinary tract infection Saturday night. I don't think it's linked to this catheter. So we can actually convince the physician to change that.
Is the reimbursement denied just for that condition or for any care at all given to that patient?
Her question is reimbursement denied just for this condition or anything related? At first they were saying, you know, from that point forward, the rest of the hospital stay is yours, which was, you know, okay, we're going to transfer the patient somewhere else. That's what we're going to do. And then it'll be a condition on admission at the other hospital and not a healthcare required. But anyway, they said they would catch that. But what they've clarified, it's the care around that. Yeah, but let's use the example of mediastinitis. There's very few patients that develop mediastinitis while they're still hospitalized, because our average heart patient stays for probably 3 or 4 days. We're practically doing drive-bys. Anyway, the mediastinitis, no doubt, started, but they go home first. If they get readmitted for mediastinitis, we eat that whole hospital stay. Yeah, so it's
just the readmission or the original surgery?
No, just the readmission. Yeah. And DVT or PE following hip replacement, they have carved out what they consider to be reimbursement they would normally give a hospital for care of that particular event and deduct that from your DRG reimbursement. So you can see the incentive to not have, well, and it's, I'm telling you this as if I don't care about patients. And obviously, these are bad events that should not happen to patients.
So are all hospitals doing baseline data on all the patients, the day one that they're admitted, like CDC for infection and a UA for infection?
Some hospitals have gone to, how many of you remember every patient that came to the ER or got admitted had a CBC, UA, chest x-ray, and a chem panel, right? Every single patient that came in. Some hospitals have used that approach. We have not used that approach, and I don't know if any of the other hospitals that you work at have used that approach, but we have decided to assess on the rear end as opposed to assess on the front end in terms of that. But there are some suggestions that, you know, we should culture, now we can do all this goofy stuff on the front end to make your case, right? And by the end of the day, it doesn't matter, it's what the physician writes in the record. Because who do they use for coding? They can't use our documentation for coding. They can use our documentation, we can use the documentation to help support when we query a physician. It's so frustrating, I could just scream, but whatever. I've been screaming for 20 years. But we can use nursing documentation to help support our argument to a physician. But at the end of the day, it's what the physician writes in the record. That's why it's so important. Any other comments or questions about that? But yeah, Jessica.
Well, I'm thinking about the DBTs and PEs post-hip replacement. I mean, what about the patient's non-compliance potentially when they go home with their Lovenox and stuff?
When they look at typically is during the hospital stay.
During hospital
Yeah, yeah. And how long, our average length of stay for hips is about 2.5 days. We get them out before they clot before our eyes. Yeah.
Jan?
Yeah.
You mentioned talking physicians out of certain things, and I'm thinking back to the earlier presentation in politics, and so are we really documenting what's really happening, or are we gaming the system?
The question is, are we gaming the system, or are we documenting what happened? And that's why we check the record. Because we are not going to game the system, we're not going to win this game, because they will come out and audit our charts. What we want is an accurate reflection of what happened to the patient. That's what we want in our coding, what actually happened. And you know how physicians will just write bacteremia.
Yeah.
The patient has a central line. All of a sudden, it's linked to the central line when I go down to talk to the coders. That by coding rules, that's what they have to do. And so the point is, we want the record to accurately reflect what happened to the patient. And if it's a catheter-associated bloodstream infection, we own it, we deserve it. But if it's not, we don't want to get hit for it. So that's why we have what we call the hack patrol. As soon as we get one of my staff has to get down there and review that record, within a day to make sure that what's in there is actually accurate.
I have a question with electronic charting and doing the intervention. Would you look at the mindset of the charting, and would you look at the correction that's made on the narrative?
It's really hateful. And again, they penalize you for like really stupid things, like 1 minute off, or they found somewhere that, in some triage, in the triage note, or the way they read it, because it's illegible, is different from the way you read it.
I don't think that I understand the answer to that question.
Okay.
Is it timestamp on the electronic charting when you open up your healthcare or whatever it is versus what you're seeing in the narrative?
Well, what they will tell us, if you have electronic charting and it timestamps, that's perfect. But many places do not have, we don't have electronic charting. So what they tell us is, if it says, they'll say let's just give you for an example, for the emergency, let's use surgery for an example. The time they want for surgical cut time is what the anesthesiologist wrote. They don't want what the nurse wrote, right? So they're very prescriptive about what document we can go to get the information. And if there's a conflict, you can get caught in that. To the actual, for example, the actual cut time. So this just went into place in this past year. This past year we started with this healthcare acquired conditions. And every hospital has their share of them, and reimbursement is going down, and we haven't heard what's going to happen on the other side with their plan for if you improve on your core measures, that you're going to get a higher reimbursement. Any other questions? Yeah.
Just a quick question. I've got students over at Center General on the ortho unit, and when we left in the end of the spring semester, the Coumadin or their warfarin protocol was in place, where the patients get their warfarin at
9 o'clock.
1700.
Oh, 5 o'clock.
Yeah, so if that's the case, for their first post-op 24-hour period, do they not adhere to that 1700 protocol then? Is that
Of course, we don't want nurses practicing medicine, and so what we are trying to embed in all the physician orders, number one is to either give it immediately prior to surgery, give it in recovery room, or we ask the doctor to write give today. And what you are describing is the source of why I've slit my wrist probably 15 times through the year is that pharmacy cannot change the 5 o'clock dosing time. There's a religious experience associated with it, and they can't change it. So what we're asking is that it be ordered as of today, or give now, and then we bypass that 5 o'clock one. Any other questions about this, these healthcare acquired conditions and the impact on the hospital? So you can see why we don't want to have these. We don't want our patients to have these either, by the way. But there definitely is. There's another CMS measure that now requires that we report any patient who dies in restraints. It doesn't matter if the restraint had anything at all to do with the patient's death, but they just want to know how many patients have died in restraints. It's within 24 hours of restraints being discontinued or in restraints. And if the restraint happened to contribute, for example, if a patient had some really adverse event associated with the restraint that contributed to the patient's death within 7 days, then it's reportable as well. So your students need to be very, and I will urge you and help your students think of alternatives to restraints and help them bring that to our bedside nurses, because I'm telling you, there are so many of our nurses that are just put the patient in restraints without, thinking through the whole, any other alternatives. So really, your students can actually be models for the rest of us. And if they do put restraints, they have to make sure they get an order, because the data we have to give to CMS, when did the patient go into restraints, why was the patient restrained, when was the order given, was there documentation of the Q whatever, 30 minutes or Q 15-minute checks, whatever, depending on the type of restraints the patient is in. We have to send all that documentation to CMS. I have no idea what they're going to do this, but I know it's going to come back to bite us.
They also want to know, what have you done, what did you do before to?
Yeah, she made a comment, they also want to know what alternatives did you suggest before you put the patients in restraints. So that's where, really, if you can help your students learn about restraint alternatives and what there may be in the hospitals, I would be truly grateful. Okay, now, in contrast to the healthcare acquired conditions that have reimbursement dollars attached to them, the California Department of Public Health has come up with what they consider to be a list of never events. And these are adverse events that happen in healthcare settings that in their opinion, should never happen. And some of them, and I haven't listed all of them, but some of them I've listed for you, just to give you an example of what we have to report now. And in 2011, this data will be transparent and will be on websites. So it's not something that you're going to take a lot of pride in when you go to the website. At pressure ulcers, if there's a common theme in any of the reimbursements, any of the regulatory and accrediting, it's pressure ulcers, and the fact that they blame hospitals for poor treatment of patients if they get pressure ulcers. Retained foreign bodies. This is a very interesting interpretation by the Department of Health. When you think of retained foreign bodies, what do you think of? Surgical sponges, right? I mean, those are needles, all the stuff that goes on in surgery. Well, if you, let's say a physician puts a epidural catheter in, and the tip of the epidural catheter breaks off as they're pulling it out. That has happened from time to time. The anesthesiologist makes a decision, I'm not going to go in and try to retrieve that. We'll look at it. That's a retained foreign body, and we have to report that to the Department of Public Health now. An abduction of a patient, suicide within 72 hours of discharge, infant discharge to the wrong parent. The kind of the sentinel event list the Joint Commission has always had, they've added to. The big caveat is unexpected death due to almost anything. They don't say almost anything, but that's the interpretation. If you have an unexpected death, they want to make sure you look at it. Burns is an interesting one. They want us to report burns. And we had a patient who had drank coffee and burned themselves, totally just, I wish you could have seen the investigation that went on. You'd think we had taken scalding water and thrown them all over the patient for those. So what's supposed to happen is the California Department of Public Health comes out and investigates. This is the only part of the budget reductions that I am in favor of. They're not coming out because they don't have any staff. So, and they're off every Friday, and so they're not coming out. But But well, here's the way the process works. They show up at your door and they say, I have this thing that you told us about, because we have 5 days to get the information to them. So we're scrambling in that 5 days. Number one, ascertaining, does it meet their definition? And if yes, what is our investigation, and getting the information over to them. Then they show up, and then they sit down and they interview the patient. Well, the patient won't be there by then probably, but they interview the staff that took care of the patient, and make a determination, was it an avoidable thing that you could have not done. The number one investigation, which one on that list do you think is number one in terms of what they're investigating?
Pressure ulcers.
Pressure ulcers are the number one reported, but the number one they're investigating is this whole thing of retained foreign body, because it's fairly evident. It was there, it happened, you did it, guilty. I mean, that's sort of the way they do it. And now they're fining hospitals for doing this. And the fines are starting at $50,000 per event. And if they feel like there was negligence, or that the hospital knew of a problem and didn't do anything about it, then the fines can go up to $250,000 per event. They're creating their own budget replacement by, there is definitely an incentive for them to come out and do this investigation and fine us. We just had a finding on one that a little tip of a piece came off during surgery. We didn't even know it could come off. You know, there was no way we would have known that, and we didn't get a fine yet, but we just got, I just got my citation the other day. But it was something other than H1N1, so that was good. So as you can, so students need to be aware of this, need to know that Big Brother's watching and we're getting fined for it. Okay, I want to cover some of the legislation that got passed that had impact in this year. That started in 2009 and will go into 2010. And one of them is Senate Bill 739, which has a focus on healthcare acquired infections. There's a lot of infection legislation that has been passed. And this one is process measures associated with central line insertions. Does everybody know what I mean when I talk about process measures? Did the person wear the gloves and masking down, and yada yada, did they disinfect the skin? The process is associated. We now have to enter them into the CDC database. The state of California goes to the CDC database and takes our data. So they're comparing, and this will also be public reported very shortly. The SB 158 requires all staff and physicians to be educated on prevention of healthcare-acquired infections, and requires reporting of specific infection, again, to be made public very shortly. Probably in 2011 is what the thing. So these are areas that hospitals are working on. How many of you are familiar with our new policies regarding MRSA screening? Okay, it's called Niles Law. It was passed in 2008. And it was based on the mom's story about losing her son to MRSA infection. So that's the emotion behind this law. And what hospitals are now required to do within 24 hours of admission is screen certain patient populations for presence of MRSA. Those patients are ones that come to us from long-term care facilities, patients that have been in the hospital and discharged in the last 30 days, any patient getting inpatient dialysis, all ICU admissions. Doesn't matter what ICU they're going to. So the neonatal ICU, we're having to swab babies when they get in there to see if they have, now how they got it would be beyond me, but the idea is swabbing them when they get in there for MRSA. And then the final one was patient who is scheduled for an elective scheduled surgical procedure with a high likelihood that they may have a medical condition that will contribute to developing MRSA infection. So think about that patient population. Can anybody identify that patient population that has a higher than average risk? Everybody says diabetes. There's nothing in the literature to say diabetics are any worse than anybody else specific to MRSA infection. So we looked at our patient population and said, how would you pull out doesn't have a medical condition? And by virtue of the fact you're having surgery, we're putting you in a condition that you're at risk for MRSA. So we are fighting the definition of this, and most hospitals aren't doing this at all. They're just saying, you know what, this literature doesn't exist. It tells us these patients are at higher risk for MRSA infection, so we're not doing it. Yikes! Don't put that in the Sacramento Bee, okay? But many hospitals have just looked at their patient population and says we can't do this. So your staff, your students need to understand when patients come in, if they meet this criteria, we have to stick a swab in their nose and send it down for MRSA. Of course there's no financial reimbursement, so man, this is the state of California. There's no financial reimbursement, and we've added about $2 million to our lab budget to accommodate for just doing this test. Yeah, that's just Sutter Medical Center. And I think I'm actually being a little bit low on that, but it's about a $2 million hit. And but there's the part, I have got to be retired by them, because in 2011, that same cohort of patients that we cultured on, or that we swabbed on the way in, they want to swab it on the way out. So if they were negative when they came in, they want to know if they got it while they were there. So I seriously have to be retired by then, because she didn't mention I'm in charge of risk management too, and I just don't even want to see these suits that are going to, these settlement things that are going to start coming up because of this. So that that's coming up. For any of our MRSA positive patients, they have to have written and oral instructions, so make sure the students take care of those patients, provide that instruction, and then they want regular cleaning and disinfection. Any questions about this one? Yeah.
I know just a moment ago, speaking of new nursing students and their willingness to work in a hospital, once they know that all this is going to happen, what is the effect, all besides these costs to the hospital for baseline measurements of everybody's health condition? What is it going to do to the staff nurses? They're going to be terrified because they're going to be called to court.
Well, the irony here is we're not swabbing any staff, are we? No, we were swabbing patients, and I guarantee you we start swabbing. And people are terrified of MRSA. They're terrified of H1N1. You know what I mean? And I think other career choices. Yeah. We don't. Some hospitals have implemented a consent. We have not. What we provide is patient education and the right to refuse, because of the whole issue about consent. The informed, I don't know what the risk benefits and alternative will be. Some doctors at one of our affiliates will not allow this routine screening to happen until they've spoken to the patient. They're worried about it showing up in their insurance papers somewhere along the line. And if the patient that meet that criteria, the same ones come, if they started dialysis, if they, that same cohort of patient has to be tested on the way out, regardless of how long they stay. I mean, think of the goofiness of culturing a baby going into an NICU, that's just come through, either C-section or vaginal birth, and they're not going to be, it's goofy. It's just goofy. There was other questions over here. That was my question. Okay, anything else? Any other questions? Okay. This is not a regulatory agency, but I want you to be aware, because every hospital in the state of California is going to have a visit by a group of pharmacists that are going to be evaluate our medication administration processes. And they call it MERP, and it stands for Medication Error Reduction Plan. Every hospital in 2001 or 2005 had to develop a plan of how we were going to do medication errors. So our pharmacy colleagues developed a plan, put it on the shelf, didn't do a thing with it, and now they're getting surveyed to it. So it's kind of like, oh boy, but anyway, it looks at all steps in the medication process. I think UC Davis had the first MERP survey. They had 5 pharmacists for a week. And do you know how pharmacists are? I mean, they only have one job, right? It's not like nurses that have 3,000 jobs. They have one job. It's all about medications. They were like right through the coals. It's changed a little bit, but But your students need to know if they have a MERP survey going on, that they are very likely to be observed for their medication administration processes. And of all the groups I don't worry about, it's the student nurses, because they are religious about taking the worksheets to the bedside and so forth. But what's tripping folks up is black box warning. Does everybody know what a black box warning is? So even if your students can just be familiar with that term, what it means, and if they're giving a medication that has a black box warning, if they can be somewhat familiar with what that black box warning is. Some of them are very straightforward. Do not give a patient pregnant. That's an easy one. Some of them, one drug, it suggests that you need to have an EKG prior to being given, and nobody does that. Nobody does it. So they need to be familiar with the black box warnings associated with the medications. We got a letter, a 90-day letter that said we're going to be there in the next 90 days, and that was July 1st, ruined my whole summer, and they didn't show up, they still haven't shown up, and we got a letter the other day saying, well, we might not quite get there in 90 days, it might be 90 more days, so now it's out to Christmas. But basically it's a group of pharmacists that show up, and they spend a lot of time down in pharmacy, but then they go out to the nursing units and they observe practices. So it's really important that your students be aware that this potentially might happen.
You signed off on a box that calls for a ECG, but you haven't done it.
We get cited for that. So the question is if the black box warning says to do an EKG and we don't do it, we get cited.
What are the repercussions and
What are the repercussions? Unfortunately, they fine also. And if they come in and feel like you are putting patients in danger because of your medication practices, they work for the California Department of Public Health. So the whole survey process starts, and you have CMS coming in the door and so forth. So the ramifications are bad. And when we had let me just give you this sort of anecdote. It wasn't an anecdote, it was a fact, that we had a state board of pharmacy come in. Remember the heparin recall? They came out and checked hospitals to see how well you did. Honest to God, we scoured the place, they found one. And I'll tell you, you know what, our pharmacy director got a citation against his license.
What?
By the pharmacy board. I mean, we fought it and appealed it and got it removed, but that's how personal this gets. They hold the pharmacist accountable. You had a question?
Are these announced visits?
No, the best they do, the question is, are they announced visits? We got a 90-day letter, and now they're not here. So, they said they're not sending out any letters anymore, so they are unannounced. They're surprise visits, yeah. And where you find is people that carry the medications in their pockets, and we find things in the locker rooms, and where they empty the pockets. Somebody else get them.
If medications are being dispensed out of Texas, how do we find the black box warning?
The question is, if medications are being dispensed out of Pyxis, how do you find the black box warning? How did you find it when the pharmacist delivered the medication to the drawer?
My understanding that there was literature or something like that.
Not for every medication. For certain high-risk ones, like Coumadin, for example, I think most of us know the black box warning for Coumadin. So for very high-risk ones, but there's over how many medications there are, and half of them have black box warnings associated with them. So you have to go to the literature and most. Yeah, and like I said, most of the high-risk ones, the pharmacy provides something. It provides something.
Sometimes Pyxis will trigger on,
Yeah.
did you check this, did you look at that?
She tells me that Pyxis will trigger, did you check this or check that for black box?
Or it's in lexicon.
Depends on the
Right. Right. I would suggest that you start with the pharmacist. Maybe the pharmacist already talked to the physician, but if not, then yeah, that's the next step, is if it has a black box warning, you can say, you know what, we haven't done an EKG, I'm not comfortable giving the med. And then usually the doctor changes the order to something else that doesn't require that. I mean, seriously, they do. Anything else? Anybody else, other questions regarding this? I'm just making you aware that this survey is every hospital in the state of California will have this survey done. That won't be done by the end of the year. but they have a plan, and these, and remember, always remember, they're pharmacists with one job in life, and that's medications, and they don't care about why you overrode the Pyxis because somebody, you know, had them in that you didn't, that you needed at the time, so.
Jana,
Yeah.
can you remind everyone that the pre-mix flushes count as a medication, can't be in the pocket?
It reminds me that the pre-mix flushes, actually nothing can be in the pockets. Really nothing, because what that gets to is medication storage, and you are storing the medication at a temperature that it's not supposed to be stored at if it's sitting next to your body. You know the little fanny packs that the respiratory therapists have? My respiratory therapy director is so adamant that they be allowed to do that. She's doing a study with little thermometers inside those fanny packs. Good for her. I said, you got to publish it when you're done. But maybe it'll work, who knows? But the whole idea of carrying medications around, you know, if they observe it, we get cited. And they fine and fine and fine and fine. So, you know, so you're crazy. Any other comments or questions? Okay. All right, now let's talk about Joint Commission for a while. And now, you need something? What? Oh, sorry.
Just a quick question. The premix flushes, are you talking about just the straight little normal saline flushes?
Yes.
Or are you talking about heparin flushes?
The saline flushes.
Saline flushes.
You can't help.
You can't carry medication in your pockets, period, at this.
Normal saline.
I know.
No, and it's probably better for the patient as a body temperature, right? But what you get hit on is the medication storage samples. They have to be stored at the temperature which they're supposed to be stored at. And it's usually not body temperature. And that's what they'll argue, if it's in your pocket, it's body temperature. They never see us fly down the hall with the lab coats flying, right? And that's nowhere near our body. Other comments? Okay. All right, I'm going to switch gears now. I'm going away from Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. I'm going and away from California Department of Public Health. And now we're going into the accrediting arm, the quote, voluntary accrediting arm that most of us pay a fortune to have done every 3 years. So we're going to start on the National Patient Safety Goals. Let me just tell you that the Joint Commission does several kinds of surveys. One is a full accreditation survey. For most hospitals, it's a triennial cycle. Every 3 years, it's unannounced drop-in survey. They show up at your hospital, and life comes to a screeching halt for the next 3 or 5 days, depending on your survey time. That is one survey that the Joint Commission does. They also do what we call disease-specific surveys. And disease-specific surveys, they have several of them that are moneymakers, and I'll tell you why. One is on stroke, chest pain, destination therapy for ventricular assist devices, and diabetes. And our EMS system, in their infinite wisdom, has now made the statement they are not going to take patients who are having a stroke to a hospital that is not, quote, a stroke-certified hospital. So, you know, I just want to see how this all plays out. If I have my stroke in Auburn and they bypass Auburn and Roseville and Kaiser and all of those hospitals to get me to a stroke-certified center, meantime I'm stroking, you know, we'll see how that all plays out. So the point here, there's a financial incentive for hospitals to get, quote, stroke certification. We had been stroke certified at one time. We dropped it for a lot of different reasons. But we at, like, for example, Sutter, and probably all the hospitals will start going to being stroke certified so that we don't lose the EMS group.
So that's going to be very interesting, because then you're going to have your paramedics in the field saying what's a stroke and what's just altered mentation from heaven knows what else.
Good. We're going to have the paramedics diagnose.
Yeah, because it means atypical presentations and just altered mentation from you took too much Vicodin or whatever.
Or they had an old stroke and now
There you
they're...
go.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
there's 100 different reasons why a patient could be illustrating those symptoms, such as low glucose. So we're going to bypass 3 hospitals while this patient's blood sugar drops even further.
You see how ridiculous this
It's
whole
ridiculous.
thing is. Yes.
Okay, never mind.
The protocol is he wants a neurologic system within 4 hours. He wants that sequence. It doesn't fit a specific protocol, then they go directly. It's very specific.
The Cincinnati
Yeah. It's going to be interesting because the other group that EMS is talking about is chest pain certification. And that one's even scarier in my opinion, because stroke you have a little 3-hour window if it's a, you know, obviously if it's a clot. With chest pain, you don't have windows of time. You want to get the patient to the nearest center. a nearest facility, and they're making the same kind of rumble about chest pain, and it's just creating a revenue stream for the Joint Commission, in my opinion. Every hospital knows how to manage chest pain. I mean, some hospitals may be better than others in stroke, but every hospital knows how to manage chest pain.
When you talk about fines, where does the money go?
The Joint Commission doesn't fine. Joint Commission charges us for the pleasure of participating in these surveys.
How much? Where does that money go?
Well, it doesn't go to me. The 50. She's asking where does the money go when we get a fine? It goes. We make a check out to the California Department of Public Health. I have no idea what they do with it. It's not, I'm sure it's not in the employees' checks. Yeah. Do you have a question? Yeah. Yeah, it's Joint Commission certification for stroke. It's a center of excellence, or whatever you want to call it, and they have it for these diagnoses that I have up here. For stroke, and they're going to be starting more. And if our EMS system links into it, hospitals are going to be obligated to do it, which just makes me crazy. You know, whenever you have any disease-specific certification, when you have Joint Commission surveyors in your hospital, they can make a left turn at any time during that survey and start surveying to the full standards. Because if they see something that they don't like, you know, if they observe a nurse walking into the room to give medication with nothing in their hands except a syringe, they know there's not a two-patient identifier happening at the bed, they can, you know, okay, we're going to stop this survey, and I'm calling back to you know, corporate office, and we'll get somebody else here to help me do a full survey. So it's just hateful process. Do I have to get on any more soapboxes? The other type of survey they'll do is based on a patient complaint. We have to tell patients that they can complain to the Joint Commission if they're unhappy. And trust me, they have that hotline number, because I get every one of them. We get 30 days to reply, but the patients know how to do it. So anyway, stay tuned for these disease-specific accreditation surveys to happen. Just in terms of the survey process, I already spoke to a bunch of this, but it's unannounced surveys. It's usually multiple surveyors, patient-focused, and they use a tracer methodology. Everybody knows what that means. They trace the patient's care based on the services that you offer. So if you don't have orthopedics, they don't do an orthopedic survey. It's open record review, which that's what we pray for all the time, because we can hurry up and fix open records. We can't fix closed records. And by fix, I mean the doctor that hasn't signed, dated, in time the telephone order, or that kind of good stuff. They do staff interviews, and this is the most terrifying part of life for staff. It's really horrible. And what I've been told, when one of my hats that I wear, I do infection prevention, I was on the national level, and what we've been told is the next 2 years a lot of scrutiny on infection prevention. So they're going to be watching for hand hygiene and all of that, which I don't worry about, again, student nurses with that. I'm going to skip a few of these slides. One of the challenging, we've talked about this, the medication storage. This is about 20% of hospitals have findings on medication storage, and it has to do with these things here, pockets and fanny packs, and then the whole issue of pain assessment and reassessment. Will we ever get it right? The nurse has to remember to go back in and reassess if whatever the intervention was appropriate. And I wish we could have a perfect flow sheet. For those of you that have electronic record, you're a little bit better off that, well, that is, somebody still has to go back in the electronic record and document the patient's response to the intervention. But if your students focus on nothing else, if they can focus on that pain and that assessment and reassessment, and it doesn't mean a medication. Obviously, if they put an ice bag or whatever intervention they use, they have to have a reassessment. In 2009, there were no new national patient safety goals, but there were 12 existing goals and a lot more elements of performance. Do you guys need to stand up for a minute? Yeah? All right. Some people want to stand up, or do you want me to just forge ahead and get done? And then, okay, if you need to stand up, you know, there's a door. No, just kidding. Goal number 1 is improve the accuracy of patient identification, and the 2 goals that are tied to this are the prior to any specimen medication, any specimen collection, transfusion, the patient is actively involved in the patient identification process. And what we tell our nurses is you don't go in the room and say, Mrs. Smith, I'm here with your 2 o'clock Coumadin or whatever it may be. You go in and you ask the patient their name, and to the extent that they can tell you their name, and then you use a second patient identifier. Some hospitals use account numbers, some hospitals use medical record numbers, whatever your facility uses is what your students need to know. And then the harder part of this is containers have to be labeled at the bedside. So if you're getting, how many of us, when you're getting a urine specimen, you go in and get the cup, you pick the label, you go in, you fill it up, and you take it. It's got to be at the bedside now with a 2-patient check. You don't pre-label the specimen containers. That's a different practice. Of course, for students, it's not different because they hopefully have never done it the wrong way. For transfusion errors related to patient misidentification, and this one I'm very confident that every hospital has this dialed, that there is a 2-patient check or 2-person check whenever we're giving a medication. They have a new word now, a transfusionist, and I don't know what qualifies you to be a transfusionist, but they must be somewhere in our facility because we were doing it left and right. And the second qualified person, and by that, so for example, a small facility that doesn't have a lot of registered nurses around, perhaps might use the unit secretary to be a second person to do a check. It really doesn't matter who the second person is, as long as there's one person that really knows the process. Obviously, a registered nurse or a physician, I use it loosely. Okay. And then the effectiveness of communication among caregivers, there's 4 sub-goals linked to this. This readback, did everybody understand readback? This is if the nurse is taking a telephone order. We don't allow verbal orders in our facility except for emergencies or during procedures where the physician is scrubbed. In other words, the doctor that's writing around saying, you know, by the way, could you just get that patient a CBC? And so we don't allow those anymore. You hand the chart to the doctor and tell him to write it. But for telephone orders, the way the process is to work is the nurse is to write it down in the order sheet, not on their hand or the napkin or where the leg, wherever. And then actually read it back to the physician before implementing. So it has to be in the chart. The idea here is to reduce the risk of transcription errors. So that's sometimes problematic if the nurse has put a call to the physician from the patient's bedside and the physician, for some unbelievable reason, actually calls back within 30 seconds. You got to have something to write on. You got to have something for the patient's chart. You got to have an order sheet. What the hospital defines is what is the turnaround time for critical values. So once the value is identified, how long do you give the lab to give you a call, or the radiologist, or your what do you call it, respiratory therapist? How long do you give them to notify somebody that this patient has a critical value? Hospitals have made a determination of who can take that notification. We request that the finder of a critical value call the registered nurse caring for the patient. Now, this has been a real switch for our radiologists because they're used to they want to talk to a physician. Well, what happened, how many of you work at, or do rounding in hospitals with hospitalists? So the hospitalist that was on at 2:30 in the afternoon isn't there anymore at 5:30 in the afternoon, and the radiologist is calling everybody they can find and nobody's getting the critical value. What we've been able to convince our radiologists is the registered nurse is going to have to get involved in that patient. If it's a critical value, if it's a pneumothorax or free air in the abdomen, the RN has a lot of work to do. And it's just as easy for the RN to take that information, contact the physician, and then they can do their chit-chat behind the scenes if they want. But the important part is somebody has that information. So the hospitals measure how long it took the lab or wherever department to notify, and then how long did it take the nurse to either do the intervention or notify the physician. So example, a critical glucose. If the nurse has a sliding scale orders, there's no reason to notify the physician. He or she can just do those sliding scale orders. So it's time to intervention. But anyway, so we've been monitoring that for some time. And we look in the record to see when it happened, because that's the only way I can tell by timing is when the nurse says they called the physician. Standardized approach to handoff of communication, including the opportunity to ask questions. And this isn't just unique to registered nurses giving report to each other. This is the patient, the hospitalist giving report to each other, doing handoff of care. Now, isn't that a clever idea? How many of you have made that midnight call? I have no idea who that patient is. I have no idea who you're talking. Okay, so you're on call for this doctor. Nobody knows anything. But all of this, the SBAR report, most hospitals are trying to use some elements of SBAR reports, some with more success than others, but the SBAR report is what most hospitals are using for this handoff. The most important part is there's an opportunity to ask questions. So it's not okay for the just to give a telephone thing and not have the nurse have an opportunity to ask any questions. Improve the safety of using medications, 3 sub-goals for this. The hospital looks at sound alike, look like drugs. Everybody has that in place. If you have your students participating in sterile procedures, there have been several events linked to pre-labeling sterile basins and things like, say for example, you have a Kevsol flush and you pour it into this basin. They're going to use it as an irrigating solution. And in this one, they pour I'm just picking drugs here. You pour lidocaine. Drugs have gotten mixed up and there's been bad outcomes to patients. So if your students are participating in sterile procedures, the idea is if you're pouring sterile water into this basin, you get the sterile water, you label this, you pour it in. The next basin is sterile saline. Take it, label it, take the sterile saline. You don't label them all and then pour them in. Okay, that's the process that they're looking for. And again, this has been a huge patient safety issue. Reduce the likelihood of patient harm associated with use of anticoagulants. Every hospital now, before you give Coumadin, before you give an anticoagulant, you have to check the patient's INR, even if they've not been on any anticoagulation prior to coming in. And it doesn't apply to short-term use, but for where the clinical expectation is the patient's lab values will remain outside of normal values, i.e., for example, atrial fib. I'm not going to go through all these, it's in your handout, but basically we're wanting to make sure our patients know when they're on anticoagulations what they need to do. And you know that anticoagulation mismanagement is one of the single most important adverse event that happens to patients that requires readmission to the hospital in terms of adverse events and patient knowledge gap. I'm not going to go through all of these. The whole hospital infection, hand hygiene, no-brainer, but I tell you, our data still hovers around 80% on a good day. We do root cause analysis. We have those bundles. New words are transparency bundles and hard wiring. That's what I've decided is the terms for 2009. That all of their expected compliance with best practices from MRSA, CDIF, DRE, and for central line associated bloodstream infections that we're doing everything associated with the bundle, and then for surgical site infections. Those are all requirements now. Medication reconciliation. The Joint Commission has actually backed off on this standard because nobody can get it right. Even with electronic records, nobody can seem to get this right. But they still require you to go through the process. And medication reconciliation is not getting a list of the patient's medications. It's taking that list and doing something with that information. The best practice out there has pharmacists doing this function, not nurses that have 10 million other things to do. When the patient comes in and says, I take the pink pill and I think I took it this morning, and who's going to do all that kind of follow-up? So MedRec is, and I'm going to go through these quickly because it's just, nobody's gotten it right. Fall reduction program, students should know what we're doing in the hospital is to prevent falls, and so should be familiar with what those strategies are. In terms of lowering the bed, if you use tab alarms, whatever it is, that we educate the families on the risk of falls and we do something about it. And this is the Speak Up campaign. Many of you have heard this from the Joint Commission, where we tell patients to remind people they need to wash their hands when they come in the room, or what is that medication you're giving me, involving the patients in their safety. I will tell you, I think I've accepted pediatrics, where moms and dads are vigilant about what happens with their kids. In other areas, I have not seen patients sort of engaging in this process, challenging healthcare workers. Now, maybe you have, which would be great. I'm just going to skip this because it's nuts. improve patient, have the patients be involved in, if they have rapid response teams, whatever you call them, and we've initiated rapid response teams, and now most hospitals allow patients to activate a rapid response team. And rapid response is a change in a condition that the nurse caring for the patient says, I need some help. The reason they expanded it to pharmacy is sometimes the patient's family is saying we need some help, and the nurse is not responding in the way that the family likes. So now we've expanded that to allow families to activate the rapid response team. Now, since we've done it, and it's been in place for probably, I don't know, 6 months or so, we've only had a handful of phone calls from family. But that safety net is in place if they feel like we're not listening. Because we know the patient much better than they do. So that's good. All right. Universal protocol, this procedural pause, the timeout, if your students are participating in any kind of operative and invasive procedure, this is the most common reportable sentinel event is still wrong site surgery, which is just stunning. It's just stunning that can still happen. And I wish we could say we've never had that event, but we've had that event, and I think every hospital has had that event. Not that anybody came to work to do that. But I'm just going to throw these out there. Just wrong site surgery. They've got fined $6,000 for operating on the wrong hip. We all remember the Florida story. They cut off the guy's wrong leg. And nobody came to work those days to say, you know what, let's see how we can screw up somebody's life. Nobody did that. So the procedural pause applies to all surgical and non-surgical invasive procedures. This includes outside the OR. This includes central line insertions at the bedside. We need to be doing the same thing throughout the hospital. And in some cases, if it's a scheduled procedure or even a non-scheduled procedure, they want the site to be marked. Now, obviously, if it's a vaginal delivery, we're not marking the site. There's some thought processes behind there. But if we're doing a right hip, right breast, left breast, they expect the site to be marked and be clearly visible after the patient's been scrubbed. This verification process now occurs at the time of scheduling, at the admission, and with the patient involved to the extent possible. I will tell you, we are not very good at this. We tend to put the patient to sleep and then decide if we've got the right patient. So it's a little bit scary. And these are all the times that it has to be done. It's the same thing over and over. Patient awake, procedure sites marked, and everybody understands what we're doing. And they also require that you have the same clear site marking. In other words, you don't write no or write some creative thing on the wrong hip, but that you actually mark the site of the procedure, because that was what was happening. People were writing, now if it was me, I'd be having no tattooed everywhere all over my body before I went in. But they were marking the wrong, the site that they didn't want to operate on, and people were getting confused. So the standard is now they mark the operative site. And obviously that whole cockpit mentality, everybody's involved. And this is where some of our surgical nurses have a real struggle because nobody's paying attention to them while they're trying to do this. We're working with our nurses to actually stop everything and everybody take a look and it requires everybody in the room participating. The anesthesiologist, the surgeon, the scrub, and the circulator. Everybody stops and takes part in the pause. All right, the rest of this I don't need to go over. That's enough. So any questions before we go into the panel? I think Annette just left. Annette, are you back there, darling? She's got a long day. She had nursing presentations.
Thank you so much, Jan. We're beginning. Should have had your packets, there was another handout that had like all these different acronyms on it and what they meant. That was for you to take with you. Also, I think some of you did not get an evaluation form, right? So I have those. pass those back. That'd be fabulous. Thank you. And what will happen is when you actually check out up front, you hand in your evaluation form, you get a CEU. So, okay. Next up, we have a small panel with representatives from the healthcare systems. If I can have the panel members come up, please. Pam Cornwell from Shriners Hospital for Children. So if you have any PEDS-related kind of questions. I have Karen Mendino from UC Davis Medical Center. I have Carrie Waters. We've been together all day today. I have Carrie Waters from Kaiser Permanente, specifically their Morse Avenue campus. And then we'll have Jan Frames from Sutter Medical Center, Sacramento. So, ladies, you want to say anything to begin with, or just get started on questions? Let's just go. All right, I'm going to leave this with you. All right, any questions? This is your chance.
All right, we're sitting here, somebody has to come up with a question.
I'm hearing crickets.
They all have pressure ulcers.
They have pressure ulcers. You guys need a break before we do the panel?
I actually have a question. It's not hospital specific.
Okay.
So today we've talked a lot about national patient safety goals and core measures, and it was a lot of good information. At the same time, one of the things I hear as director of a nursing program is that our... Okay, sorry. Today we've had a lot of good information about national patient safety goals and core measures and that kind of thing, and it's a lot of new updated information, and Jan, you're always funny to listen to. So. But the question for me is what I hear as a director of a nursing program, that often our students don't know these things, and that's something we struggle with, that we present the information. And I know, Carrie, you're an educator, and maybe you can help us figure out how we present these as concepts so that our students can actually understand them, when honestly sometimes they don't know what I&O means and things like that at the very beginning, and maybe have a discussion of how we can incorporate that as, or this information as threads into our curriculum.
You didn't ask the easy stuff, did you?
No.
I'll have to give that some thought. You're absolutely right. This is something that we want the students to be comfortable with and comfortable talking about. But some of this stuff is fairly high-level information and knowledge, and they may not have the framework to really understand it. I think approaching it from a perspective maybe of patient safety and a preventive thing might be one way to look at it. Maybe looking at key points in the curriculum that reflect back to those national patient safety goals. For instance, first semester students, hey Charlotte, first semester students are learning about medication classes. Right. So this is a great time to bring in the national patient safety goals relevant to patient identification, relevant to medication administration, some of those key points. While they may not be taking doctor's orders over the telephone, and I sincerely hope they aren't, that's not our policy, but it might be an opportunity where if they're paired with a nurse, that they might be able to be on the phone listening while the nurse does it and seeing how the process actually works and functions, particularly in our system with the electronic medical record. But that would probably be the approach that I would go, is I would look at what the national patient safety goals are and then look at your curriculum and see where I could make those specific matches. For our new hires that come in, some of them get little cards that they wear with their name badges right around the time of joint commission, just so that everybody's on board. Because our new hires and our staff have to be able to say what they are doing for those national patient safety goals. So certainly they have a different perspective, having been nurses for longer, but they still have to be able to take it and apply it to what they're doing day to day. I don't know if that helps, but...
No, that's great. That's the idea. Is what kind of ideas you could share with us to help our students better understand.
And if there's something specifically, I'd be happy to sit down with you and work on it.
You know, one of the areas that was very meaningful for me as a nursing student, one of my instructors is still here, so. But is, you know, it might be advantageous in the first semester to have a section devoted to patient safety and have the students research each of those national patient safety goals and present.
We do.
Because there's
it's just such a high level concept that that's, I think.
It's new because they don't know exactly even what they're doing with, you know, with it. but it's fairly easy to understand, you know, that we need to check the patient, you know, so.
Okay, next question. And we're down to microphone, or else I'd run back there and do my Phil Donahue, for those of you that remember Phil Donahue. Yes?
I have a question, because maybe I'm not the only one who, during this whole presentation, started to feel pretty depressed and somewhat deflated about taking our students to the hospital and now trying to help the students follow all these guidelines when sometimes the nurses say, oh no, it's okay, or I don't have time right now, or whatever the nurse says in the moment. What are we supposed to do when one of the nurses at the facility is saying, no, no, really, it's okay, or we don't have to, or whatever they say that helps to help with, when that, what do we do?
We're not walking our own talk. How about that?
Pardon me?
We're not walking our own talk. So we're telling you that's what we have to do, but we're not doing it ourselves.
Yeah. What do we do?
I would say personally myself, I'm a manager. I managed 2 intensive care units at UC Davis and also had the privilege of being a Sac State instructor many years ago. So I'm kind of partial to students. But I think if you see that consistently anywhere you go, and I'm not just speaking from like my own hospital, but I would think any manager would want this, is that gets brought to somebody's attention, because we're also spending lots of time trying to educate our staff on all these safety goals and getting them into effect, and you know, so that they can basically kind of regurgitate them back and know what they're supposed to be doing. So if you're getting a different impression when the staff and the students are talking, then I would definitely say, you know, bring it to someone's attention so that they can kind of focus on what the issues are. I mean, I'm assuming, again, I've dealt a lot, at UC Davis we deal a lot with the Sac State faculty, and I know for the most part they're pretty comfortable coming to us if there's some, you know, issues like that to kind of share, and that the managers will follow through on it. So I think even just something like you're doing right now, having this afternoon conference, just bringing all these topics to light is a great idea, because again, you know, the students, you know, they don't know. They have so many other things, like you said. They're trying to figure out how to do I&O. You know, I mean, a safety goal is kind of way above what they're focusing on at the moment. But then you see the opposite end of it, where they're at their end of their clinical experiences, you know, years down, and they're looking for PI projects to do. And I mean, they are really into it, but you know, it just takes some time, just like with the staff nurses.
There's a question in the back.
Yeah, I have a question, because it sounds like every hospital is trying to implement the national safety goals a little differently. So to help the faculty and the students who are going to X hospital and X unit, are there going to be policies and procedures in every single unit that will address all of these safety issues that the faculty and the students can get a copy of and go over during the orientation time? That would help tremendously.
Again, I can only speak for UC Davis, but I know that we would be more than willing to do that. I mean, there are definitely policies. I know in the past, this was a few years ago, I actually did go to a presentation for Sac State and did a little spiel on some of the safety goals. And as managers, I mean, we're certainly very well versed in what we need them to know. And again, would be more than willing to help with that piece of it. But I can only speak for myself, so.
Shriners would also welcome the opportunity to give these policies if needed.
Okay, hold the microphone close.
Like this?
Yes.
Guys, we'd be more than happy to show you. We have a Valley website that you can look up any of those policies and procedures on. Also has some great other references. I'd be happy to do that. And if any of the instructors want me to come and meet with their rotation and help them out, please give me a call. We're very, very open to doing that. We want to make your kids at home.
I have a question. Is that part of the facility-specific orientation for faculty? You know, that long checklist that we just created? We spent about, I don't know, 18 months working on it?
Okay, yeah. It is? Okay, fabulous.
So for those of you that maybe haven't hit the hospital yet or had your facility-specific orientation this year, that information will be on as part of the orientation check-off form. Thank you. Wasn't sure. Is there a hand?
Way back.
Way back? Well, let's start here first, 'cause, you know.
Well, kind of in that, on that same topic, we were talking about national patient safety goals, but it seems like from facility to facility, they're being implemented differently. Why is it that they're national patient safety goals, but yet facility by facility, speaking of critical values, for example, in one facility you have an hour to notify a physician, whereas in another one you have 30 minutes. Why isn't that uniform if it is considered a national goal?
I can't speak to some of the uniform requirements. I can speak with some of the patient safety goals. For instance, the timeout procedure, we've had timeout procedures at Kaiser since 2002. So that's not one of the ones we've spent a lot of effort developing specifically new things that we're working on. I think we're all doing very similar things, but because some of us are at different points, we have an electronic medical record, so our two patient identifiers are based on some of our barcoding now too. So there are some key things and elements within the different hospital systems that make the process of implementation slightly different from facility to facility.
I would say that's probably exactly at our place too, that just because if you think about it, the medical center is a little bit different than say a Sutter and a Mercy, just because of, you know, the physicians being there or the residents or whatever. So there might be a few tweaks on how the goals are actually implemented, just because we have to get it kind of around the workaround that we do all the time as far as notification and things like that. But I would think overall that everybody's kind of on the same page.
Fundamental.
Because you don't really have a whole lot of choice. I mean, you can't, you know, it's sort of like just what do you read into it? You know, what do you think you can, what's the most you have to do, what's the least you have to do, and try to find a middle ground where everybody can sort of happily reside.
Other questions?
I had a question about when you were speaking about joint commissions and the CMS, if there's some sort of an event that is reported and you talk about them coming in and then interviewing the staff and all of that, is there a possibility that the students could end up being interviewed and or the faculty? And is there any kind of liability or what kind of accountability is there?
That's good to answer this because we've probably all been there. In fact, if a student is involved in the event, yeah, we would ask to interview. Now, interestingly enough, the student is under no obligation to do that. And the California Department of Public Health can just request that. And what we typically do is we call the student and tell them. And the liability is no different than, you know, than your current liability. And it's not like, okay, the student made this mistake, we're hanging them out to dry here. That's not how we operationalize that. But in answer to your question, students and faculty could be. Because what could happen is they, like say for example, a medication error happens and something bad happens to the student. What they're going to look at is what are our policies and procedures related to student oversight by the faculty. And if they have a finding for us, we'd probably get a finding on something like that. But it wouldn't, you know, it's not about shoot one and the rest will follow. That's, you know, that's not the attitude that we take necessarily. Even though I'd like to sometimes, but no, we don't.
Yes, Dale.
You know, there's a lot of variation when there are various surveyors come to the hospitals regarding canceling clinical for students, which can create tremendous havoc about meeting minimal hours that they need to have. Could you please speak the pros and cons of that practice?
Excellent question.
That is a good question, and well, I'm kind of at a loss. I've been with Kaiser for 2 years, and I came in the week before the last Joint Commission survey, which was loads of fun. I can't say that I saw any clinicals cancel, and I can't see, I can't imagine.
when we have those discussions, because we do have those discussions, I'll be honest with you, whenever we know we're going to have a joint commission survey, and it's only to decrease the possibility that the student could be asked questions for which they're not prepared. It's not about a worry on the hospital side. It's more the whole interview process, because students are fair game. They want to know what the orientation was, and all of the kind of stuff that we hold staff accountable to. So we have those discussions. It's really the final call is with this, and then sometimes the directors on the floor just don't want that added pressure during a survey week of having, some of our student experience, we have 5 or 6 student nurses on any floor. Some of the managers just like, I can't do that in addition to everything else, that's expected. So, have we ever canceled yours? Have we? At summer?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm seeing a resounding yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I think it's more just decreasing the likelihood that a student will get picked for a question, and quite frankly, I think they'll be more prepared than most of our staff, but that's really kind of the rationale. It's between the whole thing of getting as many people, so the nurses can concentrate and focus, and everybody's ready to be served, interviewed at any time.
I think one of the takeaways would be that as a health system, that we take back to our management team and help them understand the impact to the nursing programs when that happens. The rationale is sound, I understand that, but at the same time...
It's not really sound.
Actually, at our last Joint Commission survey, we had a student that was caught and surveyed and questioned, and who did beautifully, absolutely beautifully, did a wonderful job, reflected beautifully on their school and beautifully on our facility, and we were very pleased with that.
So it's all fresh information for them, they haven't been practicing for 20 years and forgot what an orientation. But that is a good take back though for us, because to be fair, we should be communicating with our internal teams to let them understand what the impact is to the nursing programs when they make those decisions, and how that impacts the students. So I'm going to take that back. Yes.
On the same vein, as far as variation, get very close.
Ice cream.
Okay. On the same vein, we all try to meet the recommendations and desires of our employees and our healthcare facility partners as far as preparing our students for entry-level practice. Yet we continue to face various barriers on their ability to gain these practice and the skills that allow them to do that. Blood sugar testing at the bedside testing, IV push medications, interacting with physicians. So in the practice across the board is different per facility. Yet we struggle with how to make our students the most marketable in this current environment. Can you all speak to that, all of you?
Wow. No. I would say that most of the times it really just comes down to whatever regulations are given us by California board as to what the students can do. I don't really know what type of upper level discussions might go on as to how far do we want to take this or push it, and do we really want to fight for the students to be able to do things. I've never really been involved in any of that, so I unfortunately don't have a whole lot of exposure to that. I mean, I know what you're talking about as far as the students being limited in some of the things that they used to be able to do, say 10 years ago. These things weren't any problem before, and then all of a sudden it's all gotten, taken away from them. But in the same vein, there are even things that have been taken away from, nurses, just because, again, it's, too much quality, too many quality control types of things that you have to follow with the lab and things like that. So it is unfortunate because obviously the students need to have those experiences, and like you said, you want to make them marketable when they go out into the real world.
Well, it just so happens that we have a representative from the Board of Registered Nursing here, Katie Doherty, that many of you probably already know, but she has a response.
Thank you all very much.
Just so you know, there actually is an advisory statement on our website that basically says that there are no limitations in what pre-licensure registered nursing students may perform in the clinical area. So they may do all of the things that would be expected of a registered nurse as part of their pre-licensure education. And if you go to www.rn.ca.gov and you click on practice information in the category of registered nurse, you'll find that advisory statement. And thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about that. Couldn't be better planned.
Thanks, Katie. Do we want to continue on with that question or?
I will just tell you from I really have no idea why we restrict practices. If we can do everything, we're going to work into the bone as far as I'm concerned. So I'll take that message back to my nursing educators. They're the ones that design the curriculums for what our student nurses do. So I'll just take that info back.
We have a follow-up back here.
The guidelines for the point of care testing are guidelines by the state of California lab, and they say that only a licensed personnel, and student nurses are not licensed personnel, and that's why we've not been able to let student nurses do point of care testing.
That's my understanding from Kaiser too, is it has to do with that regulation. They're still trying to hash it out. A lot of the limitations that we've imposed on the student nurses come to us, and it's trickled down from Kaiser National, Kaiser Regional, on down the line. And while I can take back recommendations, it's then got to go up the line. And it takes time. It takes a lot of time. So hopefully sometime in our lifetime, we'll see things change and get better.
One of the things that I would suggest is that you contact the Board of Nursing to have the discussion with CLEAR, whomever it is that's restricting point-of-care testing for registered nursing students. And we have that discussion. There's been no one who's contacted the board, to my knowledge, to have that discussion.
And CLIA is?
CLIA is the clinical lab services testing, the accrediting body for moderate complexity testing that's done in hospitals. So I think it would be helpful to really have that discussion with whoever the representatives are. Department of Health Services has said a number of times and reiterated a number of times there are no restrictions in what pre-licensure students may do as part of their approved program and study. And that would be the lab services through the California Department of Health Services.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Yes, I do think there is required competency testing on the equipment that we use. So depending on how long the students are going to be there, would determine whether we would go through all the competency testing.
I'm so excited because these are exactly the kind of conversations we were hoping would come out of today. And there's a question way in the back.
Mine. If hold it really, really close. Mine is just a comment. I'm Terry Dean from Sagamore University, and I've taught at 4 of the hospitals represented there. And we've had conflicts in infection control and various areas of safety. And I really want to take the time to thank you, each of you, for not allowing the horizontal violence to go on and to step up and be role models for our students. So kudos to those hospitals in the area who have supported the programs. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Other questions, comments? Really? No? Question? Okay, well, thank you so much. If there's no other questions. All right, I want to first thank Jan Frame for taking time out of her crazy schedule, I know. Thank you very much. A token of our appreciation. I also have
items for each of our panelists. Thank you very much for supporting us today and answering those questions. And I'm assuming you're going to be around in the event that there's any other little follow-ups that come out. Now, I was asked to close with, to end off the day with a little update, kind of on the hiring situation. I know there's some questions around that. So let me just load up my presentation really quick and I'll jump into that.
Bouncing mine on the table and I bounced it away.
Managing workforce development. I do lots of different things, but one of the things that I do is I work with the Extended Campus on supporting our graduates from the program in obtaining employment. Our success metric for that program is graduates licensed and actually practicing in the state of California, presently in the greater Sacramento 6-county region. I work with the recruiters and some of the nursing educators of the other health systems. We have graduates that may actually already be employed with those health systems or have an interest in working in another health system. So we make sure that we have, that our graduates have access to exploring those opportunities. We've done a couple of things to really stay connected with them, find out kind of where they're at in their careers. The first graduate from that project, which has been so fantastic, was in February of 2005. I can't believe it's been 4 years already. So they've had an opportunity to not only practice, but continue their education, maybe move to different units within a facility. Some have moved to different facilities, and that's okay. Our goal was to actually produce more nurses for the Sacramento region. So it's happening. So we have a Facebook group, and everyone seems to be on Facebook. So we have a Facebook group where we're able to actually stay connected with the students, find out what's going on. Are they moving into managerial or supervisory roles? Are they continuing their education and are now ready to teach, maybe, if we can get them to do it. And one of the challenges we've had most recently is new grads getting employed. You guys have probably heard that and have some concerns about it, and so do we. And so the good thing is I'm going to share some national information with you just about how healthcare is still growing, but just maybe not as fast, and there are still opportunities out there, but the graduates really need to be creative and flexible. But also there's all this economic stimulus money is kind of starting to flow, and there is a national or statewide effort by SINC, the California Institute for Nursing and Healthcare, to do nursing residency programs, which would give us an opportunity to employ some of the graduates using a different funding mechanism than our typical hospital budgets, which are so tight, and then being able to give them kind of a residency and give them additional education and keep them working until more positions open up. So hopefully those grants are due October 5th, so hopefully those will be successfully funded. That will go a long way to helping us be able to open up the doors to more new graduates. So, in a nutshell, hospital employment, during kind of the hot years, probably about 2002 to last year actually was growing at about 30% average employment. Because of the economy, we haven't been growing as fast. We've been growing at about 3%. Now the reality is 3% is not as great as 30, but it still is growth, which in any industry is huge right now. And so we also know that a lot of our staff members that are eligible for retirement have decided not to because of the uncertainty in the economy. And that we know as soon as things start turning around and people are more confident, their retirement funds come back, we're going to have a huge exodus. So instead of the kind of the trickling out of nurses that we anticipated, we're probably going to have a huge wave. I call it the silver tsunami. Where all of a sudden, those that are eligible to retire, they're going to all retire all at the same time. Right now, within the Sacramento region for Sutter, 11%, or 350 of our nurses, are eligible for retirement today. We still have our outlier, the nurse who's 84 years old now and works full-time. She's, she's obviously never going to retire. God love her. She's not going to. But we have that first wave of barely baby boomers who have been with us for 30 plus years and are ready to do something a little bit different with the rest of their lives. So we have a huge challenge that we know is going to be coming. shows you that employment in other industries compared to, healthcare is under general surgical hospitals, human services is still growing. Not as fast as tourism and hospitality as of last year, which is interesting. So that would be anything from your conventioners, visitors bureaus to your museums and your hotel stays and that sort of thing. And that's because people are staying closer to home. So that industry is actually still growing. They're not maybe going to Europe for their vacations. They're going to stay here in California for their vacations. So I did some research nationwide. So this is as of May of 2009. The National Association of Colleges and Employers showed us the percent of U.S. new college graduates employed. And here's what really is happening with the new grad RNs who have not been able to find opportunities, employment opportunities. They're in the same boat that I probably was when I graduated from college so long ago. It's just that a few years ago, even 3 years ago, they had a job before they graduated because we were so desperate for new nurses. What we're really seeing is normal. It's not out of the norm. It's just different than what we've experienced most recently. It's not unusual that, 2006, 78% of the new college graduates had employment. 78%. I can remember, there were nursing, even with the nursing graduates that were being produced 3 years ago, there was still a huge demand. We were importing them from other countries, doing whatever we could to get more nurses. 2009, 20% of the new college graduates had employment. And I'm guessing that's probably, the statistics for your facility, your schools, is actually probably better than 20%, right? So you're actually still ahead of the national curve. It just feels different than their friends who got jobs before they graduated, which is when they started maybe their prerequisites or actually started their nursing program. People are a little bit surprised. The employment outlook for registered nursing is still extremely strong. This is information from the California Labor Market Information Division, a fabulous arm of the Employment Development Department. They do wonderful research work. And as of April, it's still expected that by 2016, we are going to be short 17,000, we will need 17,510 nurses in the greater 6-county Sacramento region. Excuse me. I've been talking all day. For those that know me, now that's not really that challenging, but it's catching up with me. Okay, so currently our estimated employment is that we employ kind of 13,000 RNs, so we still have a huge gap in 2016 of about 4,000 RNs, which has actually remained pretty consistent over the last 5 years, that we just can't quite see. Even with all the expansions that you guys have done, which has been so amazing. I know that you and all of your faculty have worked really hard to teach what you do so well to tremendous numbers of students. I know that. Even then, we still have always been behind the curve, and it is just this little blip in the economy that has just kind of derailed us a little bit. But we still need to keep doing what we're doing. So as of May 2009, and I apologize, yes sir? By 2016. Not just hospitals, but also long-term care. Let's not forget about them. Did you guys all hear the question? Were the hospitals projecting the 5,000?
And that's based on projected retirements, right?
Based on projected retirements. As well as projected retirements, but also new programs, new models that may be coming on board, new patient care models that may be coming on board, or service lines. The whole geriatric service line is going to mushroom. And so we'll need people trained in that particular area as well. So it is replacements as well as new.
And
yes.
also nursing faculty.
And nursing faculty. No, we're not going to let you guys retire. Yes, the nursing faculty. Yes, Cheryl.
So there'll be a commensurate number of training positions or interim committee positions to meet this demand from the hospitals. Did I understand that correctly?
In theory.
Okay.
In theory.
I always want the absolute truth and the absolute
The reality is, I think if we are more thoughtful, because we have this information, I think we have a unique opportunity of not necessarily reducing the number of nursing slots that have been expanded through all these wonderful grant opportunities we had, but ensuring that we're being thoughtful about how we admit. So do we need to admit 70, 80 at a time at a particular program, or do they admit 40 twice a year? What does that look like so that we're staging the graduates and you're not all of a sudden having 600 graduates come out, which is what we graduated last year, by the way, in the greater Sacramento region, 637 graduates. When we started these projects back in 2002, this area produced about 230 nursing graduates. So we've had a tremendous ramp up, we've had a tremendous influx of new talent into the hospital systems, and we have reached kind of that, that magical point where you're out, almost have too many new grads. So I think if we're thoughtful about how we admit and when are people going to be graduating, we work together to create those scenarios, then yes, in fact, we could accommodate those IPs that are coming out. If you have 300 IPs coming out all at once, that's a little bit more challenging to address. So if we're thoughtful about it, I think we can make that work. So okay, so back when I was taking just a peek, between full-time and part-time positions, this was May, June time period. Kaiser had the most positions open, and then this is the greater 6-county Sacramento region. They had 41 at the time. We had 36 full-time, part-time. And when I say graduates need to be flexible, because literally, I work with them all the time. We communicate on a regular basis. And it's like, well, okay, they've given up getting day shift, but they still don't want to work. Some don't want to work nights. Some don't want to have to commute. And it's like, well, do you want to work or don't you? If you want to work, I have a long commute. I mean, that's because I chose to live out in the boonies, and okay, but an hour commute's not unreasonable if it means you're going to have a job. And is it the job that you ultimately want? Well, probably not, but that's okay. Your goal is to get employed, get a paycheck, and get experience. So when things start moving again, you can move into your dream job. And so that's the message we really need to be sharing with the graduates out there. And the students that just started, they're going to be in the same boat 2 years from now. They need to be really thoughtful about where they're going. We've had graduates go to long-term care, which is, they didn't even get that exposure or that experience. And we've been talking about that at Health Community Forum. How can we broaden the exposure for students so that they understand there are opportunities out there outside the acute care hospitals? And so the message should be, going forward, there's jobs out there, be creative, be thoughtful about what you want to do, and realize that it's not your dream. I was a secretary when I graduated from college. That wasn't my dream, but I needed a job, so you have to start somewhere. Yes?
But part of the problem that we're seeing is the new grad who takes the job in long-term care. They work there for a year, they go back to the acute care hospitals, and the hospitals don't consider what they did for that year as experience.
That's our job to work on that piece, and we are in fact doing that. Especially recognizing the fact that either people have long-term care experience, or they may have been out of school 6 months and don't have any experience. So what does that look like? What kind of orientation does it look like for them? That's our job. That's actually, at least in our organization, that's my job, to try and figure out how do we make that work for the new grads and for the staff as well. Any other questions about employment, hiring? Those are just the key messages we just talked about. And that was it. I didn't give you the statistics for us. You guys don't care. Let's be honest, it's late in the afternoon. Yes?
I've seen these waves before. One of the messages I give my students is, when I came out of college in 1987, the country was on the verge of a nursing shortage. And they were going overseas to the Philippines, they were hiring nurses from all over. So I basically had no choice of where I wanted to go.
I graduated in 89.
Then, when I moved to California to pursue my doctoral program, when I got laid off from the research grant, I needed a job. And I had been working as an advanced practice nurse, and suddenly all the acute care hospitals were saying, we're not going to hire you. You don't have to.
We've had some students I know that have gone to an AD and BSN Bridge program, just to continue their education. That was their long-term plan anyway. That's a great option for those students that wanted to continue, because we do need the faculty, as Sandy pointed out. So hopefully they'll wind up doing that for us. Any other employment questions? Well, thank you, and I apologize. I didn't print out the presentation, but I can send it out to the nursing directors, and so you guys can share it. I think Stacy's at the front desk, where you can hand in your evaluations and get back your CEU certificate. Thank you so much for spending some time with us this afternoon. We look forward to seeing you in the facilities.